Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 531st Board Meeting of the California Regional Water Quality Control Board, Central Valley Region. I would like to introduce the board members and staff at this time. On my far left is Carmen Ramirez of Atwater. Between Carmen and myself is Jenny Lester Moffett of Davis. On my far right is Bob Schneider of Davis. And sitting to my directly to my right is Sandra Miraz of Alpa, and my name is Carl Longley, and I hail from Fresno. I'll now introduce Pamela Creedon, the Executive Officer, who will introduce her staff.
Thank you, Dr. Longley, and good morning, members of the board. Across the room from me to my left is Andrew Altavot, Assistant Executive Officer in the Sacramento office. I just promoted Andrew. I have an announcement to make at the end of the statement. No, I'm sorry. Next to Andrew is Patrick Palupa, Senior Staff Counsel for the board. To my immediate right is David Coop, Senior Staff Counsel for the board. To my far left is Karen Lanfranchi-Rizzardi, Executive Assistant for the board. And to next to Karen is Ken Landau, I'm having trouble today, Carl. Dr. Longley, sorry. Assistant Executive Officer in the Sacramento office, and to my immediate left is Alex Mayer, Staff Counsel for the board. There's Clint Schneider, Assistant Executive Officer in the Reading office, and Clay Rogers, Assistant Executive Officer in Fresno, and Richard Lankarovich, Assistant Executive Officer in Sacramento, in the audience. We have a number of staff people. We also have Bob Crandall, former Assistant Executive Officer from Reading, in the audience, and I have not seen Tam Dodak yet. She'll be here tomorrow. Thank you, Dr. Longley.
Thank you very much, Ms. Creedon. Jenny, would you please lead us in the pledge?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to the minutes, and first of all are the February 6th and 7th minutes. Do I have a motion?
I'll move.
Carmen moved, Sandra seconded. All in favor state so by saying aye. Aye. Opposed say no. We'll then go to the March 12th minutes. Do I have a motion? Jenny's moved. Sandra seconded. All in favor state so by saying aye. Opposed say no.
I'll abstain.
And Bob's abstaining. So the minutes are approved. We'll now then go to the meeting procedures. In order to conduct our regional board meetings in a fair and efficient manner, we will be proceeding in accordance with the meeting procedures that have been provided with a summary agenda and are available here at the staff table and upon request, and are posted on the board's website and are summarized on the computer screens during breaks. Any questions or comments regarding these procedures may be directed to Karen Lanfranchi-Rizzardi, the administrative assistant. Board member communications. Do we have any discussion?
Carl, I just want to report that I had attended a marijuana discussion that Clint Snyder put together as a member of the marijuana subcommittee. So this was discussing the marijuana issue, and it was a work with informing and developing partnerships with Cal Trout Unlimited, and Nature Conservancy, and Clint did another great job. Thank you. Also, I spoke at an Assembly Natural Resource. That meeting was on the 14th, and on the March 24th, Monday, I spoke at Assembly Natural Resources information hearing on mercury issues. I spoke mostly. I didn't speak for the board. I was attending as a member of Tuliomi, the nonprofit that I work with, but I've been informed about mercury issues with the great work that this board has done. So, thank you.
Thank you. And while you're talking on mercury issues, I have been in I got to get the name straight. I'll report on it later.
Yeah, I mean, the intent here, a lot of this work was done by Elizabeth Izzy Martin, who's with the Sierra Fund, helping to put the hearing together. And the intent of the hearing is to air a problem that's ongoing, a difficult problem, but, you know, when problems are difficult, you need to get started. And that's what this is about. And one of the pushes I've been doing is just whichever one of the water bond issues emerges needs to include funding both in the Delta, but primarily we're looking also at upstream sources of mercury contamination for cleanup of those sources.
And I've been in phone contact with, on conference calls with Andre Ventura and Frazier. What's Frazier's last name at Davis? Caught you with your mouth full, I'm sorry. Schilling, that's right. Purpose of those is putting together a workshop. There is some concern that both the EJs and the Enviros may not be on the same page looking to the future on certain funds that may be available for rehabilitation of wetlands. And your name's mentioned a lot, Bob, in those conversations. So while I've started, I'll go ahead. On the 20th and 21st of February, I attended the Multi-State Salinity Coalition meeting in Las Vegas, where I presented a paper on processes for salt management. I had a moderator for that session who was terrible. She just insisted that I stay in my time limits. 27th of February, I was at the Panoche Water District. Yorm Cohen from UCLA, Dean Little from New Sky, folks from the Panoche Water District and DWR. Primarily Little and Cohen were the presenters talking about treatment technologies that yield revenue streams for salinity management. They were speaking to their own technologies. The revenue stream part is very important. 3 March, I participated in an agenda review for the March 12th meeting. On the 5th of March, I moderated a session at the Groundwater Resources Association Conference in Sacramento. On the 6th of March, both Pamela and I were at an environmental teach-in at EPA Region 9. On the 12th of March, of course, I was at the hearing we had here. 13th of March was CV Salt's Executive Committee meeting. The 20th of March, pre-hearing conference with Walker Mine and tailing site cleanup and abatement orders. 24th of March, breakfast with Perry Clausen of CV Salts. And 27th, 28th of March, regional Central Valley. Oh, that's the day. Excuse me. Yes, Carmen.
I just have one quick thing. I did attend a meeting in Merced, California for the California Women in Agriculture organization. It was just their annual meeting. And I didn't present or anything. I was just to attend it.
I just have one item. Last night I was on a conference call or yesterday afternoon I was on a conference call for that was hosted by CDFA for the drought, on which there were Tom Howard and Felicia Marcus did speak, as did folks from other agencies as well, just to discuss the drought in general.
Thank you. Any further? Yes. Alex.
Yeah, if the board members are done with their communications, there was an issue about the use of water board email addresses that came up at our March 12th hearing. And there were some questions that were asked that I promised to follow up on, and I was prepared to do that now. So just as a brief recap, earlier this month, the Office of Chief Counsel circulated an issue paper to the executive officers of statewide, and in that issue paper there was a recommendation that regional water board members, as opposed to using a personal email address or their work email address, that they would use a specific water board email address to use to conduct board business and the purpose behind these recommendations are to streamline the board's responsibilities and responding to those responsibilities under the Public Records Act, discovery requests, and even the record retention policies of the boards. And that issue paper recognized that there were some pros and cons to using these new email addresses, but overall the benefits outweighed the inconvenience and learning curve that may be associated with moving over to a new email address and having to check 2 email accounts for emails as opposed to just one. And so there were some follow-up questions that I'd like to address now. I also plan on writing up a brief question-and-answer document that I'll circulate to the board members so that you'll have it in your files for reference. But let me jump into the questions now. The first one was if a board member is using an email account that is managed by a public agency like a federal, local, state agency, would the recommendation apply to the recommendation to switch to a water board domain apply? And the answer to that is yes, that the recommendation would still apply to any email account that is being used outside to conduct water board business that is not part of the water board domain. And that's because the new system that we have in place is streamlined in that there's a proof point system of managing emails now that didn't previously exist, and it makes it very easy and efficient to respond to a Public Records Act request. But that system only works for those people that are using the water board email domains. And so we often respond to requests for documents by typing in a query to a database in this proof point software. And that brings up the relevant records for production, perhaps. And if the emails that the board members are using for board business are being generated outside of that system, it's not able to achieve those efficiencies. So that's the reason why the use of a public email account would not exempt the need to use this water board domain. Another question that came up was regarding a practice that has developed where some board members are using the water board domain but are not checking it on a regular basis, and therefore to communicate with the board members, sometimes a person has CC'd their assistant at the board member's office. And so that's a third party that is being included on some of these emails. And the question is that a practice that falls within the recommendation or outside of the recommendation? And you know, the safest answer to that would be even that practice is a little bit outside of the scope. A better practice is to not CC a third party, because there might be some potential attorney-client privileges that could be waived using that practice. So the safest thing to do is if you were concerned that a board member hadn't read his or her email that you sent them, that the best practice would be to try to follow up with that assistant with a phone call, as opposed to sending them an email that may waive the privilege. Third question that came up was, is there any significance to, or would the recommendation in the issue paper also discourage the practice of opening an email using the water board domain and forwarding it to the alternative email account that you're more familiar with, and and possibly responding from that from that alternative email account. And in terms of the Public Records Act and the record retention, it's easier again for that proof point system to be operating if you're being disciplined in using the water board account as opposed to forwarding it out to a alternative account. Technically speaking, the forwarded email would be a duplicate, and therefore we could use the Proofpoint software to recall in terms of a Public Records Act, to recall the responsive records and be streamlined in that function. But the biggest breakdown is with the record retention policy. This Proofpoint software actually serves as an additional function of helping board employees and possibly board members in adhering to the record retention schedule, which allows for certain emails to be discarded after a certain period of time. And so if there's a practice that develops between forwarding emails to a primary work-related email, then there could be some problems with the record retention policy not being fully adhered to. So and if the board member did in fact respond to the email that was forwarded, if they used their alternate account to do the response, then now it's more difficult to retrieve those records in the event of a discovery request or a Public Records Act request. So overall, it's possible to use that practice of forwarding an email to an alternate email accounts, but overall the benefits are still outweighed as opposed to just trying to be disciplined and using the water board account primarily for those communications. The last question that came up related to, and if there are any questions, please jump in or wait, ask me at the end.
Well, I guess I have a question, and having not used the water board's system, and I will be using it within a few days, does it allow you to make files in which to put it's not a file.
Yeah.
Folders in which to put files, and if so, are those also scrubbed? Because we get information that I don't want to get rid of, quite frankly. And if you're going to force me to print it out and then scan it and put it in another file, that kind of doesn't make a lot of sense.
Right. So the actual retention period, I'm not clear on what that period is for the board members. I will look into that and respond in the write-up that I promised. There are folders in the group-wise system that are used, but in the Outlook system, thank you, Pamela, that are used, and they do get scrubbed according with the retention policy. What I've done to save longer term emails is to copy that into a standard folder. That's not in the email system, but that's part of my desktop. And that practice of copying and moving it to a file on your PC has worked for me to preserve emails that wish to be retained for a longer period of time. So it hasn't been a major problem or issue in terms of keeping important emails for future reference.
If I can just, Dr. Longley, the State Board and the attorneys created this. We've had a habit throughout the board of people using their email as their record, and that's problematic. That's why we have the record retention and the recommendations from OCC is if you need it, especially for our staff, you make part of the file. You create the file and not keep it in your email system because it's subject to loss. And it's a good practice. So we have this retention policy that we all have to adhere to in terms of documents, but not using your email system as the filing system for that. in Outlook, I found it's easy to click and say save as, and it'll save it as a document, so it's still easily retrievable.
Yeah.
When you put this together, Alex, if you could frame this memo as efforts to be more accountable to the public instead of more defensive about our email needs, I think I'm pretty reticent on this when I think about why we need to do it. But if I view this as our openness and accountability to the public, I think it makes a lot of sense. So.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point that I'll be sure to do in the questions and answers. The last question was involved the use of smartphones to send emails and text messages relating to board business, and the question was whether using a text messaging system on your phone, smartphone, personal smartphone, whether that possibly would be subject to a Public Records Act request. And the answer to that is yes. No matter what system is being used to conduct board business, those systems could conceivably be subject to Public Records Act request, our record retention policy, and discovery requests. So, in light of that reality, use of the water board systems, if there's a linkage on your own smartphone, and I know I do this sometimes on my personal phone, you can log on from an internet website to your water board account to conduct these types of communications. So again, the practice of using that water board domain email address as opposed to text messages, because now you're using a new system that is not linked to the Proofpoint software anymore. You're losing those benefits by just sending text. Obviously, if you do happen to send a text message, that's fine, as long as if there is a request for responsive records, that we remember to look through those old text message archives and possibly retain them if they do include board business. Preserve those according to the record retention policy, so that they can be transparently produced upon request.
Is it possible to ping us when, like, an important document goes into our folders or something, to our private accounts, just to say you have a message at your state board account or something?
Yeah, that was the. I don't know, but when you say ping, if that's a technical thing, computer terminology, but I was thinking ping would be picking up a phone.
I'm looking at a heads up. Can you send us? Is it possible to send us like the agendas on your state board email?
Or you have a message from the water boards.
I think that the way to do that would be to.
I don't know if we can do
use
that
a phone
automatically.
call.
We'll use. There may be a way for it to automatically notify you, and I don't know how that is. So we'll just have Karen send out a reminder to.
That's
Check your
basically
emails.
what it has to be. It's
it's
just a reminder. And I just don't want, because I might not check it, but once a week, that something
If it's anything
important
important, what I've
relayed.
done is sent
that
us
might work,
a
though.
separate message to your personal email saying, please check your water
Yeah, that's, I
board.
think,
So if it's
appropriate.
really important, otherwise, we can send out general notices that your water board information's been sent to your water board address.
Yeah, so that might work in terms of, might have to call up. I think that system would work, or a phone call would work as well.
And
some way of
and I
prompting.
found, and it may be a function of the fact that we get so many emails today, that people don't follow their emails regularly, and you'll send them an email and don't get a reply. Then I found recently it's good to use text. Don't you read your email? Not quite that abrupt, but a text message like that contains no content other than you have an email, so I don't see anything wrong with that. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
as long as it's non-substantive, it
Yeah.
should be not a manageable issue. So that makes it through all of the questions that I written down. If there are more, please feel free. Also, I'll be writing this up, sending a question and answers to the board members, hopefully to a water board email address, and we'll look forward to that. Thank you.
Was that a hint?
Well, what's the schedule for getting the water board addresses together?
We just, if you're, it just telling us you want one and need one, and we will get you set up.
I need one. I want
Okay.
one.
They got me one, and they told me when they got me one that I'd had one for a long time.
I think most of you have them. It's just a
Yeah.
matter of getting them
I
activated.
just need to know how to access
Yes.
what I
Yeah.
need.
Yeah,
to
we'll
be
we'll
doing.
write up some general instructions for the web access, and also, I guess when you're in the office, you'll have direct access.
So you would like one, and anybody else not have one that wants one at this point? I'm writing down.
If I don't have one,
Okay, okay. So
Yeah.
one for everybody.
So,
you don't have- okay.
you may, most of you people have access to your emails anyway, but at those that don't, you may be starting to get more and more emails, because the water board email address is pretty easy to guess and send. So I guess the attorneys, I guess I'm speaking for them, just be careful of ex parte communications. So
Well,
you may get something that we don't have, so.
And
we-
that's one of the things that I really don't like
Yeah,
about this,
and-
is I've always preferred communications to go through the staff and then to me.
Right.
And
So
now
this
there
may
is
be-
not going to be that filter anymore.
No, it's
Exactly.
very easy to guess what your email address is.
So
Well,
yeah,
you can go to the state website for address and contacts and get it that way. So it's you're pretty
Yeah.
trackable once you're in the system.
and the issue paper, I'll send that along as well. Anticipates that possible downside. Came up with some suggestions to mitigate the problem. Was auto replies that gets sent out saying I don't regularly check this email, and have some certain language that was drafted up in the issue paper. I don't recall the exact language, but I believe that might be a way of mitigating that issue.
Yes, Sandra.
Ken, I don't need one. I have one. That is not on a personal computer. It's a computer, but it's on the state.
Yeah,
one.
she's equipped with a state issued computer with a web.
Okay, if there's any further discussion, we'll move on. We got a big day ahead of us. Executive officers report.
If there are any questions on the report itself, otherwise I have some staff presentations to make, Dr. Longley.
Ready for the staff presentations. What?
Public forum, Dr. Longley.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't have any cards. Is anybody wishing to address the board on anything that's not on our agenda? Good. Executive officers report.
Thank you, Dr. Longley. There's Superior Accomplishment Awards. And for the first award, it's going to a group from our Reading office. We have two members here, Ron Falkowski, sorry, I'm going to mess up your name, and Heidi Bauer. It's also going to Stephen Rockledge and Katie Connaughton. They are assigned to the non-15 waste discharge requirements unit in the Central Valley Water Board's Reading office. This award is for their collective efforts to move forward in the WDR unit after an untimely death of the unit supervisor, Greg Cash. For several months, they worked with limited direction, continuing to implement Greg's plan for the WDR waste discharge requirements, unit, and worked together to bring issues to management for discussion. In particular, focus was placed on reducing the permitting backlog through the use of appropriate general order enrollments and the drafting of individual permits as needed. Compliance and enforcement activities also continued with 10 facility inspections accomplished in the quarter on top of all their other work. Their patience through the process of filling Greg's vacancy is appreciated, and their hard work following such a tragic loss is admirable and impressive. These efforts required the team to take greater responsibility for their projects, work as a team, develop solutions to problems, and keep a positive attitude. And they're being recognized for their efforts. Thank you. The next one goes to Tessa Foget. Tessa has provided invaluable contribution to the Water Board's effort at processing pesticide water pollution. She provided critical support for the completion of the diazinon and chlorpyrifos Basin Plan Amendment, which it was released for public review in January 2014 and is on the agenda for this meeting. She is also the lead staff for a major challenging project, the pyrethroid Pesticide Basin Plan Amendment, and has successfully advanced this project towards completion on schedule. Tessa has provided invaluable contributions to the development of aquatic life criteria, derivation methodologies for both water and sediment, and the development of criteria using these innovative methods. Her knowledge on pesticides is a resource to all the water boards. Tessa prepares excellent comment letters to the U.S. EPA's Office of Pesticide Programs and that have resulted in improvements on how EPA addresses water quality concerns and their pesticide registration process. She also provides critical support to the engineers, non-scientists in the office, on the interpretation of toxicity testing data. She has worked well with stakeholders and has been a good representative of the Water Board's pesticide control efforts at public forums such as pesticide applicator education events. So thank you, Tessa. And the next one goes to Sean Walsh, an environmental scientist in our Confined Animals Unit. He demonstrated superior job performance in the course of investigation and preparation of enforcement documents for a pair of challenging enforcement cases in the Confined Animal Facilities Regulatory Unit. In the course of his routine inspections in May 2012, Sean identified and documented numerous violations of the General Order for the existing milk cow dairies General Order and the Water Code on an operating dairy and on a heifer ranch that had requested to be removed from the order. Sean worked diligently to identify the scope of the violations on both properties and assisted in the development of cleanup and abatement orders for the facilities in an effort to obtain compliance, and also then in the development of the administrative civil liability. He displayed exemplary professionalism in the conduct of multiple inspections and preparation of detailed inspection reports necessitated by the lack of responsiveness from the discharger and the need to closely track the lack of compliance with the cleanup and abatement order deadlines. Sean is an extremely dedicated employee who works long hours in the field to complete inspections and discharge investigations. His efforts have raised the profile of the Confined Animal Program and promoted compliance with the Dairy General Order. And for that, Sean is being recognized. On behalf of Sean, I'll accept this award. Okay. Usually I'm told if they're not going to be here.
I believe he might be out on inspections today
Oh, it's
because of the rain.
It rained.
Yeah.
Okay. We do not have a stormwater unit or dairy unit right now with the rain. And the next one is Dean Hubbard from an engineering geologist in our Fresno office. I saw Dean earlier. Dean is being awarded for his effective technical and project management skills in leading the effort to revise the waste discharge requirements for the chemical waste management facility at Kettleman Hills in Kings County. Revision of the WDRs for this facility was a very difficult and complex task. It involved extensive coordination with other state and federal agencies that also permitted the facility, and it required extensive stakeholder and interested parties communication and outreach efforts. Dean has served as the project manager for the Kettleman Hills facility for the past 2 years, following the retirement of the previous project manager. He did this in addition to his other water board duties in the newly reorganized oil-filled unit. He was instrumental in keeping all staff new to the Kettleman Hills facility project properly informed and oversaw the drafting of the tentative WDRs to their successful completion. Dean's assistance was extremely valuable in addressing the ever-shifting project issues and providing answers that often required digging through numerous boxes of historical files and or on the microfiche. For this effort and much more, Dean is being awarded the Superior Accomplishment Award. We Okay, I have a final award for Renee Smith in our administrative unit. She's not here, so I will read her award and then provide it to her when she returns tomorrow. Renee is in the administrative support section, providing much needed support to a variety of programs within the region. Renee was assigned the duties of the training liaison earlier this year on the heels of the consolidation of training resources at the State Board and the issuance of a governor's directive limiting travel that impacted training opportunities. The consolidation of the governor's directive meant significant changes to the process and requirements for acquiring training. However, at the outset, procedures were unclear and changing regularly. With very little guidance but a great deal of initiative, Renee followed and refined a process to ensure that information for training requests and registrations for our staff was clearly communicated to the State Board. She developed positive working relationships with the State Board training office staff. She developed and maintains an accurate tracking log of all training requests, and she provides timely responses to inquiries. Renee is a dedicated employee, always going the extra mile to ensure that any job she does is done completely and accurately. She demonstrates a positive attitude and a high level of customer service. She's a tremendous asset to our organization. And I'm happy to see this one. Our technical staff deserve all the awards they get, but our admin staff, they're the silent warriors for us, so I'm happy that she's receiving this award today. So we'll take some pictures now. So that's it, Dr. Long. And I apologize. I have about another week of these braces, and then I'll quit struggling, although I struggle anyway over words, but I really struggle with these braces in my mouth. So. Any questions or anything else? Otherwise, this completes my executive officer report. Dr. Longley.
No, thank you very much. And I need someone out here to turn my screen on. No? Oh, there it is, bottom button. I was doing the side. Thank you. Young kid over here. Very good. Thank you very much, and let us congratulate you again for the service of this board. You carry a tremendous workload, and it's amazing what you get done. Are there any other comments on the executive officer's report? Not then we will go to agenda item number 6, nitrogen use and management in irrigated agriculture. This time we'll hear from a panel of experts on the use of nitrogen fertilizers and reporting of nitrogen management in irrigated agriculture. This is an information item only and no action will be taken, although the board may ask questions regarding the presentations. Following the presentations, interested parties will be allowed 3 minutes each to address the board. We'll now begin with the presentations, being led by Dr. Doug Parker from the UC President's Office. That's
Oh.
right.
So Dr.
Office
Longley,
President.
this was at the request of the board to have this panel. If timing had allowed us, we would have had it earlier in the process, but I contacted Doug. I've worked with Doug on a number of things. He's been active with the Irrigated Lands Program, especially in the Central Coast. And so working with him, I put together, basically asked him to create a panel to help answer some questions for the board. And I did poll the board for questions, and Dr. Longley gave me a series of things he's interested in learning about. So I presented that to Doug, and with that, he put together this panel. And Doug, were you going to go through the resumes or bios, or do you want me to go through those?
I'll let you do it.
Okay.
Sure.
So we have a panel of 4. So Doug is the Dr. Parker is the director of the California Institute for the Water Resources and Strategic Initiative leader for the California Institute for Water Resources and Strategic Initiative, and he's the leader of the Water Initiative. He is the director. He's the director of the California Institute of Water Resources and Strategic Initiative leader for the UC Agriculture and Natural Resources Water Quality, Quantity, and Security Strategic Initiative. He coordinates water-related research, extension and education efforts across the 10 UC campuses, the UC Agricultural and Natural Resource System, and other academic institutions within California. Prior to joining the University of California, Doug worked on water quality issues related to the Chesapeake Bay as an associate professor and extension specialist in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at the University of Maryland. He also worked on issues related to California water as a cooperative extension economist at UC Berkeley. Doug obtained his PhD in Agricultural and Resource Economics at UC Berkeley and bachelor's degrees in Economics and Environmental Studies at UC Santa Barbara. So Doug will be opening this item, and then the panelists will include 3 individuals. The first is Patrick Brown. Dr. Brown is a professor of plant nutrition and horticulture at the University of California, Davis. He obtained his PhD in agronomy and international agricultural development from Cornell University and has been a professor at UC Davis since 1989. Dr. Brown research focuses on the uptake, function, and management of nutrients in agricultural plants and covers fields from basic biology to field management and extension methodologies. He has published 140 peer-reviewed scientific articles and several hundred industry-focused publications and communications. Primarily, research focused over the past 10 years for Dr. Brown has been the optimization of nitrogen use in almond and pistachios. And he will discuss nitrogen management for the board. Dan Monk. Dan Monk has, for the past 23 years, Dan has worked with the UC Cooperative Extension as an irrigation, soils, and cotton farm advisor in Fresno County. He spent his early career evaluating soil and management factors influencing infiltration rates in soils. He has studied subsurface drip irrigation for row crops and evaluated plant growth and development dynamics of San Joaquin Valley cotton. Dan began investigating cropping systems research in the late 1990s and is currently involved in several conservation tillage projects focused on short and long-term water management elements in annual cropping systems. More recently, he has worked on crop water use monitoring projects in almonds, processing tomatoes, and Pima cotton, and has a long interest in California water resource management. And finally, Alan Fulton has been a University of Cooperative Extension farm advisor for nearly 26 years, 11 years in King County, in the San Joaquin Valley and 15 years in Tehama County in the Sacramento Valley. In between the two farm advisor positions, he also worked 4 years in the private agricultural sector as an irrigation manager and pest control advisor for a family-incorporated farm in the San Joaquin Valley. He is headquartered in Red Bluff, California. He completed a bachelor's degree in plant and soil science and a master's degree in soils and irrigation sciences from Colorado State University. He works in the four-county area of Tehama, Glenn, Colusa, and Shasta counties. His extension activities focus on irrigation practices that use water efficiently and productively, farming practices to protect and enhance surface and groundwater quality, and community-wide policies to manage groundwater and surface water resources. And with that, I'll let Doug take over.
Before Doug takes over, Doug has told me that they're compressing a day and a half into 60 minutes or less. And, you know, I just think that we're going to be inundated today, and we probably need to find a way down the road to continue this conversation. With that, Doug, looking forward to it.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Yeah, what I'd like to do is, we've got 3 other speakers here to talk about nitrogen management. What I want to do is brief the board quickly on the curriculum development and training in nitrogen management. So as you know, we've been, this team has been, and others beyond this team, involved in a series of trainings for certified crop advisors on nitrogen management, working with CDFA. So we've just completed 5 of those trainings. I wanted to bring a little bit up to date on how those trainings went. And again, as Dr. Longley mentioned, you know, those trainings were a day and a half. We're going to bring some pieces of those trainings out for the board today, but we're certainly happy to come back and talk about other pieces and other places that we can talk about as well. So in terms of the trainings, again, these trainings were for certified crop advisors only. They're the ones who will be certified to sign off on nitrogen management plans or on nitrogen reporting, depending on how all of that works out over the next year. We did 5 trainings and trained about, well, we had 549 people sign up for the trainings. 529 actually completed the trainings. You know, a few no-shows, a couple people just came for 1 day, so that they didn't get certified if they didn't stay for the whole thing. But it was the largest set of trainings ever done for CCAs in the state. So most of these trainings were sold out, and so people traveled to other locations to get the trainings at times as well. So the program, again, was a day and a half session, and I'll run through it just to give you an idea of what we were training people on. The first day was sort of a general session, pretty common throughout all 5 locations. The second day, we broke the group to talk about annual crops or permanent crops, and we tailored those sessions to the locations we were in. So we tried to pick crops that were grown near those woodland locations or Fresno or Salinas locations, et cetera, for that second day. We're putting all of that information online for the people who took the training. It'll be a public website, so anybody can actually go and look at it if they have any interest in it. The curriculum outline, just to give you a piece of what we did, was we began with sort of talking about the course, why were people there, how can nutrient management training not only help the environment, but help the farmers' bottom line as well, because if they're able to use nutrients more efficiently, they obviously should be having increases in profits. Then we had presentations on the nitrogen cycle and crop production system. So these were fairly detailed presentations on the chemistry of the nitrogen cycle. Dr. Brown was the one doing most of those, and he's going to do some of that today, but I don't think he's going to get to that level of detail for all of you. We had very good responses to the training on that type of stuff. A lot of the CCAs saw the training as very good, you know, bringing them that back up to speed on where they needed to be. Some of them saw it as new material, others saw it as sort of review of material. They all come in with different levels of expertise, although a certain level of bar of expertise because they were CCAs. Then we discussed nitrogen sources, so we talked about commercial fertilizer, organic sources, different types of commercial fertilizers as well, foliar treatments, all types of different nitrogen sources. Irrigation and nitrogen management was a big part of what we talked about as well, and we're going to talk about some of that today, so I'll let them bring that up. And then nitrogen budgeting was discussed, and then some general stuff, future resources, tools they may be able to use, online web tools, things like that that are being developed or already developed. And we also had a space at the end of the first day for the regional boards to come and give an update on what's going on in their region, so the CCAs were up to date on where they were. And then, as I mentioned, day 2, we broke them into annual or permanent crops and really got down and talked a little bit about how would you manage it for this crop. What would you do if you had this scenario? What would you do if there was some tweak in the scenario, an unforeseen event, weather event, or something else that made you have to kind of change mid-season what you wanted to do? In terms of who took the training, you can see that the majority of the people worked directly for fertilizer companies, about 42%. About 20% worked for a crop production company. 14% were independent consultants. 16% worked directly for growers. And then about 7 or 8% worked, had just sort of other in terms of who took the training. Locations, most in the Central Valley. Some also a fair number in the Central Coast. A few people from Southern California came up to take the training, some from the North Coast, and even some from the Imperial region made the trip in order to take these trainings.
Doug, how closely do you think, and this is subject to judgment, does this coincide with actually the use of fertilizers? This breakout on.
Oh, in terms of the
right
people on the obviously I mean I would say if I were trying to look at the use of fertilizers, I would probably base it not knowing what the different regions are doing, mostly on the basis of acreage and crop production. And so this would be weighted, much more towards the Central Valley. And I think people saw the Central Valley as the place where most of the nitrate issues are being talked about, and Salinas Valley. So you see those two are the two big here. We didn't do trainings in the other areas, and the boards in the other areas are following different paths right now too. So there may be future needs for trainings in those areas.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And here's a little bit about experience of the people. Most of the people had over 15 years of experience working in the field. A few with, 10% had 0 to 5, 6 to 10, or 11 to 15, about 10 to 15%, 12% of each of those, and then 65% over 15 years. There are a lot of people currently taking the CCA training, and so those numbers keep growing. But just people taking the test aren't always just new to the field. They may be people who've been PCAs or pesticide control advisors working in agriculture for a number of years. They just never got that training. And then we asked them sort of what was most helpful, and this breaks into way too many possibilities, but the nitrogen budgeting was by far the thing people felt was the most useful of everything. Some people thought the whole training was useful, about 13%. The nitrogen cycle was very useful. Irrigation was very useful, and kind of a scattering of other kind of things that people found useful in part of the training. And we asked them, do you feel you're better able to manage nitrogen and meet requirements? And the majority of people definitely said yes after going through the day and a half of training. And a little bit, we did some questions on sort of how is your change in understanding of using nitrogen changed from the training. So you can see what you see on here is, so the first top one here is my overall understanding of nitrogen management before the training and after. And you see sort of a shifting downward of people from slight to moderate down into the good to complete level of understanding of nitrogen management. And again, in terms of irrigation management and relationship, we see the same type of shifts in all of these. More people who didn't feel very comfortable with it before felt a lot more comfortable afterwards. And their capacity to advise the development of nitrogen management plans, again, increasing as we went through those trainings. So that I just wanted to give you a background on that, but what we really want to talk about more today is on the ground, how do we manage nitrogen? What are some of the complexities that growers face? And some of that's going to come right out of those trainings. As I mentioned, we're going to take slices of the trainings and give that to you today, and then be open for questions. So I'll take if there's any questions on my piece right now before I turn it over to Patrick Brown.
I just have one question.
Sure.
So you said 529 people were trained. Do we have an idea of how many crop advisors there are in the state or in the valley, and whether we have an adequate mass that will be trained and prepared to help growers?
Yeah, so currently there's something around 830, 840 certified crop advisors. I believe that's the current number who have passed the test. I know in February about 150 or so took the test again, but so that doesn't those aren't included in that, and I don't know how many pass. I don't know what the pass rate is on the test. It's actually a fairly difficult test, so it's not like 80% of people pass. It's actually a bit lower. So, we should be getting up close to 1,000 within a year or so. The question of whether that's an adequate number is kind of subjective. Nobody's really looked at it yet. I think it's a great number to reach the majority of the farmland. When we start talking about smaller and smaller acreages and stuff, then we have different questions. If you're 10 acres or, how small of a farm do we want to go down to when we look at these things? And I think those people are less likely. It certainly covers probably the majority of the farmland, though.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Doug.
Thanks. I'll let you find yours on there.
All right, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to the board. As Doug mentioned, I'm going to distill my 4.5 hours of speaking at the CCA training into 15 minutes. And what I chose to do here is give you the perspective of nitrogen management as it was presented to the certified crop advisors. It's also the perspective that we've been presenting to almond growers, pistachio growers. Since I work primarily in the tree crops, there's a bit of a tree crop focus here, though the principles hold true across all of the different crops. I'm going to use this diagram, which we put up multiple times in the presentations. And when you think about nitrogen cycle and how to optimize nitrogen management in agriculture, it's really about balancing your supply with your demand, getting to the trees, to the crops, the amount of nitrogen needed when they're needed to ensure that productivity is maximized, but at the same time minimize the opportunity for loss from the system. There are some complexities. It makes a nice, easy diagram here. However, the devil is in the details. On the supply side of the equation, some of the inputs are, of course, easily quantified, the commercial nitrogen fertilizer that you put into the system. It is also relatively easy to quantify the amount of nitrogen that comes in with the irrigation water. I'll show you a formula for that later on. Where we have some complexity is in the contributions that's coming not only from cover crops, manures, and composts, but importantly, and particularly for the annual cropping systems, complexity that comes in from recycling of waste of plant materials in the field. In the case of broccoli, for example, lettuce, a large amount of the nitrogen that was in the crop is returned to the field in crop residues. There are indeed a good deal of complexity in the nitrogen cycle in the soil. The ultimate goal of any nitrogen management program is to keep in the soil only what is adequate for the plant to grow at full productivity, and not to have in the soil an excess which, if managed poorly, is a potential loss for to the cycle. The third part of the complexity that's involved is the demand part of the equation. Implicit in this budget act, in this balancing act, I should say, is the ability to estimate what crop demand for nitrogen will be. And that's important to do not only on a mass balance, how many pounds per year is taken off the crop in a broccoli harvest or an almond harvest, but also when during the cycle that demand occurs and how to deliver the nitrogen with explicit timing that matches the demand of the crop. So we'll step through some of those attributes and where the complexities are. Towards the end, I will show some examples of field research and where we have managed to get the efficiency of use quite high and where the outcome and what a reasonable estimate would be for cropping systems in California. Implicit in nitrogen cycle, of course, is also water management. Nitrogen that sits in the soil has the potential to be lost if not taken up by plants, but that potential is only realized if water pushes that nitrogen below the root zone. So you can maintain high levels of nitrate in the root zone that does not represent a threat if water is not present to push it through the cycle. My colleagues will talk a little more about water management and how that ties into this process and this balancing act. There's a framework which we've used with the certified crop advisors and growers that puts this in perspective, and efficient nitrogen management can be summarized in these 4 R's. The goal is to apply the right rate, and what we mean by right rate is to match the supply with the demand. Implicit in that, of course, is to know what all of your supply factors are, what nitrogen is coming from fertilizer, what nitrogen is coming from irrigation water, what nitrogen is coming from the soil itself. Also critical to that is the right time, optimizing the availability of nitrogen in the cycle with the demand of the crop, putting the nitrogen in the right place. I'll show some examples of where making that mistake diminishes efficiency dramatically, and using the right source and the right monitoring and evaluation techniques. So how do you take that first step, finding what the right rate is? You know, if you're dealing with a celery crop or a broccoli crop, it's a fairly simple process. You take samples during the year, you look at the total biomass, total nitrogen accumulation over time, and you use that to construct a demand curve. When you deal with the tree crops, it's a little bit more difficult because you've got to deal with the entire biomass of the plant, and a lot of growers are not particularly keen on tree harvesting in the way that we talk about tree harvesting, chopping them out of the ground and partitioning them. But having done that for a lot of different crops and searched the literature, you can come up with numbers such as this. So this is a list of a variety of crops, heavy on the horticultural crops here, and it tells you how much nitrogen to expect will be in the crop exported from the field on the basis of the yield itself. I put a stars there next to the numbers which we have got a good solid research basis on. The remaining numbers are mostly drawn from the literature without a California-specific analysis, though they will be representative. Now, of course, what's removed from the crop is a very adequate estimate of demand in an annual cropping system. When you get to a perennial cropping system, you need also to have information on what is being taken up into the growing tree, what is required for growing new architecture, new trunks, new stems, etc. And I'm going to put a couple of examples of this to illustrate the point. In this case, this is orange. This is data derived from Italian work, actually, not UC work. But a couple of things to illustrate here. Estimated uptake in this particular case, and this is corresponding to a moderate yield. This 20,000 pound yield would be considered moderate to moderate low in Californian context. And of that 74 pounds that's taken from the soil, only 26 pounds is removed from the orchard, with the remaining 40 pounds, 50 pounds going into woody organs, going into leaves, and a fair proportion of that returning to the soil. So in order to generate and make sense of these sorts of budgets, you need to partition them into these different fractions to determine not only what's leaving the orchard, but also what is implicitly required for the tree to grow. If you contrast this version here, which is for orange, fleshy fruits, and it would be quite similar for peaches and pears and apricots and things like that, with what you can see in an almond context. And you'll see here the uptake values in this case, 305 pounds for a moderate high yield of 4,000 pounds. And contrast that with the previous, we're at 74 pounds. Also contrast the amount of nitrogen that is being removed from the field, 272 pounds, tenfold greater than was removed in the orange crop. So there's a very good deal of crop specificity in developing these budgets. There's a requirement that the information is available and developed. You will notice in this particular case, the amount of allocation that goes to the trees for growing the wood, it does not differ very much between orange. What differs is the export. If you look at the case in vegetable crops, these are some numbers derived by Tim Hartz at UC. A couple of things to illustrate here. We're looking, in this case, lettuce, broccoli, celery, spinach, and strawberry. The nitrogen removal in harvest, which is on the right-hand side here, I have numbers in the middle range. So this is somewhere between what a peach tree would do, an orange tree would do, and what a nut crop would do. The difference and the important difference in the annual crops is that there is a very substantial amount of nitrogen that is taken up into the biomass, the broccoli stalks, the lettuce roots, the celery stalks, etc., that is not removed from the orchard, from the field. So in this case, removals in the 60 to 80s, total crop uptake in the range of 100 through 200, and you have application rates here in the range of 100 to 200, 250. So if you look at the balance between what is applied and balance that against total uptake, that's fairly good balance there. If you balance what is applied against what is removed, application rates are 1.5 or twofold higher than removal. In the annual cropping system, this represents a challenge in management because you have in the field a large amount of nitrogen that is cycling through the residues that becomes a difficult form of nitrogen to manage, when it will be available to the plant, how much of it's going to be available in this year versus next year. So annual crops face a different series of challenges than perennial crops do because of this very large recycling factor that goes on. So if we look at this cartoon again, I've illustrated some of the complexities there in the supply component, calculations of how we get to the demand component, and introduced that in the soil nitrogen cycling, this becomes a big challenge for the annual crop systems that recycle large amounts of nitrogen in the soil. So you can put this all together in a sort of a worksheet, just a simple equation, demand on the left, which we've described, and then the supply on the right. And the supply of nitrogen can come from nitrogen in the soil derived from those residues that are being cycled. It can come from supply in the soil from compost and manures and other attributes that are added. We have in most systems of flood irrigated cropping agronomic systems some reasonable knowledge of this parameter. In the tree crops, we have a very poor knowledge of this parameter. They're very different systems, and we've not done the research in this regard. Nitrogen in the water, that's a fairly simple equation I'll show you in a moment, and nitrogen in the fertilizer. There is always the question, of course, what is the relative efficiency of these different sources? I'll show you some estimates of those in a moment.
And to that point, this equation would suggest that the difference, in other words, the inefficiency times the supply, is never available to the crop. Is that possibly available to the crop in later years, or?
Right. I'll show you an example of that later on. Nitrogen that is not used in a current season because the supply was in excess of the demand, as providing it is not washed through the soil with an irrigation or a rainfall event, is indeed available for the subsequent year. So you cannot separate the nitrogen management from the irrigation management. However, since you can't necessarily predict rainfall over the winter in a lot of our regions, the fundamental principle of keeping this as tight as possible in all years is a valuable one. But it is a good point to illustrate that nitrogen is not lost merely because it's out of balance. It's only lost if it is both out of balance and leached.
Thank you.
There we go. So in terms of the inorganic, the contributions that come from organic manures, etc., there is a lot of data that illustrates how much nitrogen you will get in a ton of a compost or a raw manure. And that's valuable preliminary information, but estimating how that supply of compost is reflected in current year nitrogen uptake by the plant, that's a difficult science, which we're still resolving and getting more information on. The nitrogen in irrigation water, there are some fairly straightforward equations. You just multiply the concentration of the nitrogen by the amount of water, and it generates the number of pounds provided. There is some questions, of course, about how efficient nitrogen, when provided in the irrigation water, how efficient is that as a source of nitrogen? We are undertaking a CDFA FREP-funded project to address those questions right now. But in the interim, we've established that we've been working on the premise that 70% efficiency is what you can expect, which is the same sort of efficiency levels that you would expect from a fertilizer application. So for the moment, that's what we've been utilizing as our basis. You can do some very simple equations. In this particular case, it seems to... if we had 2,500 pounds of almond, we know that there's 68 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 pounds of almond. That gives you 170 pounds of nitrogen demand. This is not fertilizer demand, this is nitrogen demand. You then subtract from that what you've got from the water. You come up with a very simple equation, says there's 153 pounds of nitrogen required. The next question then becomes, How do I provide 153 pounds of nitrogen, recognizing that not every pound of fertilizer will become available? There's been discussion, and the dairy order utilizes this number of 70% efficiency. And so for this discussion, I will utilize that as well. You just simply multiply or divide these by 0.7. You would generate a fertilizer nitrogen rate. Now, I think it's relevant here to think about this 70% and what are the circumstances where this can be achieved and what are the conditions under which it will not be achieved or it will be compromised. A lot of it depends upon the knowledge of the crop advisor, knowledge of the grower, and how tightly and effectively they can implement those 4 R's that I mentioned previously: right rate, right time, right placement, right source. There are some key examples of where this efficiency cannot be achieved, and I'm going to just show very briefly some of these. Year-to-year variability in yield, poor irrigation practices, my colleagues will mention that in a moment, variability in the field, poor timing. So this is a graph of pistachio. Now, pistachio is notorious for being very variable in its yield from year.
If I could interrupt,
Yep.
excuse me. So what about carryover nitrogen?
Okay, carryover nitrogen I'll actually address here in a moment on this particular slide, actually. I always like good questions that predict to the next slide. Okay, so in this particular case, these are yields. It's all relative to the 2005 yield, which is the 100% here. But you see yield variability all the way down to a 2006 incident where the yield was only 5% or 10% of the maximal capable yield of that field. Now, under this circumstance, if a fixed nitrogen rate were applied, 270 pounds, 250 pounds every year, you generate efficiencies overall of 60%, with the majority of the inefficiency coming from the poor yield year where the fertilization rate was not adjusted accordingly. Now, in terms of the carryover issue, you will see certainly in that subsequent year you have an apparent efficiency of greater than 100%. How do you get an apparent efficiency of greater than 100%? It means the nitrogen that was in excess from that prior year is available for the plants. So in this circumstance, we don't have an estimate of how much was lost, but you certainly have an implication that carry forward from prior year activities is a valuable source of nitrogen.
So for tree crops especially, nitrogen that you apply this year will affect your yield for next year. It affects your yield this year to a degree, but it mostly affects your yield for the next year. You're setting the fruit crop, the fruiting tree limbs and stuff like that for next year, this year. So how does that factor into this and the budgeting that a grower might want to do?
Certainly this year's status impacts next year, but I think it's incorrect to say the majority of the impact of this year's fertilization is on next year. And the reason I say that is if you look at a pistachio and almond crop, the crop will export in a single year in the realm of 200 pounds of nitrogen in a good crop. The amount of nitrogen required to grow a tree optimally is 20 pounds. So if you are only interested in growing the biomass for next year, you need only provide the 20 to 35 pounds of nitrogen. If you want to grow the crop, you need the 200. So most of the action, if you want to put it that way, is indeed in the current year. In lower export crops, peaches, fresh market peaches as an example, that ratio between nitrogen going in the crop and nitrogen going into next year's growth is about 50-50 as opposed to 90%, 10% in the tree crops. One of the big issues that's come up, as we increase field size, you decrease the ability to be efficient. And it's illustrated here. There's a pistachio field, a 40-hectare field, 80-acre field. And the colors just represent different yield zones of the field. And so you have portions of the field, the blues and the greens, very high yielding. You have portions of the field, reds and yellows, small, lower yield. Now, in most California fields, you only have a single point at which you can inject fertilizers into the system. So now you're faced with a challenge. What part of this field should I optimize and how should I fertilize this field given that this variation occurs? Now, when we talk about efficiency factors in a moment, one of the key drivers of inefficiency is this variability in yield. Now, this matters much more in circumstances where there's a lot of winter rainfall, where that nitrogen can be lost from the system, and less in systems where there's less winter rainfall, where that leftover nitrogen can be used the subsequent year. Now, it's sort of a counterintuitive as we move to larger fields and more fertigation and single point injection, we actually introduce inefficiencies when we may be intuitively thinking we're getting more technical and decreasing inefficiencies. So what could a grower do? They could split the field up into 5-acre plots. That would be a nightmare of management. You could split it into 10-acre plots, possibility. You could even just split it in half. And we were asked, Pamela mentioned, so what does this mean in terms of efficiencies? In this particular case, just as an example, if you treated these two halves of the field independently, you can save 1,700 pounds of nitrogen and increase your nutrient use efficiency 25%. So these are the sorts of things that growers and consultants need to think about in getting to that next level of efficiency. Now, underlying this, of course, there's a lot more complexity than I'm illustrating.
What sort of factors would lead to the differences in production that we see in this slide?
So part of this would be a differential soil characteristics, water retention, unfavorable. This was west side Kern County, so there were some unfavorable soil conditions, high alkalinity, poor root permeability. So some of it is that. Some of it, and as I said, there's a lot more complexity in here, is the nature of pistachio. If you look at this field in the subsequent year, the pattern reverses. So what was high this year becomes low next year. And it really illustrates the need for a sophisticated agronomist to be aware of that and to react accordingly. On occasions I'm asked when I present this, well, that's all very nice, Patrick, but what am I going to do about it? And at the moment, my only response is, well, you could pretend it's not there. And clearly that's not a viable response. And there is some economic incentive here to put in a valve and save that 1,700 pounds of nitrogen. A more realistic and attainable example is this example I have on the screen. This is aerial imagery in early spring of some almond acreage, 160-acre blocks. What I've put up there is the final yield from each of those plots. If all of these individual fields received 275 pounds of nitrogen, which is a fairly common rate in this part of the world, then you derive efficiencies of nitrogen use anything from 35 through to an apparent greater than 100%. Now, the point of this slide is simply to illustrate the need for field-specific management as opposed to property-specific management and getting to the specificity of an individual orchard or vegetable crop in managing and deciding upon your fertilization rates. It appears a fairly trivial analysis, and yet it's a very important one because it's not been the context that some managers have been working under.
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
Do you think that sometimes the temptation will be to try to, put more nitrogen in to try to, do the growers sometimes think if I put more nitrogen in, then my lower producing side is going to produce more, when really the recommendation I saw here is to not, sort of follow that temptation?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And in the workshop, we spent quite considerable time illustrating that you cannot force feed a tree. A tree will eat what it is hungry for, and you don't get additional yield by going beyond satisfaction. So that's a very important point, and one that we've been illustrating a lot in the training workshops. When during the season do you put it on? The curves of nitrogen uptake are available for all manner of crops. This is corn and soybean, and there's some traditional slopes. And basically the principle is to apply your nitrogen when the demand is greatest or immediately preceding the greatest demand, so that you satisfy and don't restrict the crops in any way. That's examples of corn. There's a number of different crops here. This is an example from the work we've been doing in almond. And the important part of this is the yellow part of the curve here, which is the nitrogen going into the nuts. We discussed before how much of the nitrogen proportionally goes into nuts versus trees. So if you contrast the beginning of the season, this brown color, this is the perennial portions of the tree, with the end of the season, the brown color, That's only 25 pounds difference in total nitrogen in the tree biomass, whereas the yellow portion represents 320 pounds of nitrogen in this particularly high cropping yield. So this gives guidelines for the whens and the wheres of application. What sort of efficiencies can we achieve?
Patrick, could you give some idea of, when we talk, and I know it may vary somewhat, but when we talk about pounds per acre of nitrogen, what does that translate in typically, given application costs and so forth per pound?
Yeah, that's a good question there. I think 100 pounds of nitrogen, I'm just going to ballpark this, is $80, $150. So in terms of the value of the crop, the cost of the nitrogen is fairly trivial, usually in the 5 to 8%, 5 to 10% of production costs, of fertilizer costs.
So if you had 1,000 acres and you saved $15 per acre simply by decreasing nitrogen application, that's a considerable savings.
That's a considerable amount of money, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
What sort of efficiencies? We've done the long-term trials with this, and I've just circled the optimal efficiencies that we achieved in these experiments. Now, I would point out these experiments had everything right going for them. We were spoon-feeding the right amount of nitrogen at the right time. We were working in an environment down at Buttonwillow where it does not rain, and so we did not get any winter losses. We were irrigating and injecting our nitrogen according to all best practices. But we certainly did achieve, over a multiple year period, efficiencies of greater than 70%. Now, for the reasons I illustrated previously, not adjusting for yield, not timing correctly, not managing nitrogen correctly, having a lot of in-field variability would all compromise this number. But it is achievable under good circumstances. And I should point out, these sort of efficiency levels, when contrasted with studies done in crops all over the world, are extremely good. Most cropping systems where they have estimated the efficiency of nitrogen use are in the 50% realm. California, drip irrigated, low rainfall, well managed. We could certainly do better than that. So Pamela had put a few questions to me. They're not all here, but I'll answer them now. What are the most effective management practices and what annually can be achieved? I think that 4 R's, that balancing the inputs with the outputs, is the key, but it requires in it good knowledge of the physiology of the plant, of what the demand will be, predicting forward what you might expect. It requires in-season adjustment and awareness. If the yield is not as expected, then adjusting accordingly. It requires leaf and soil sampling from time to time to make sure that you're on schedule. I think that has a good deal of attraction to growers because it's intuitive, it's logical, and it is a sort of a self-driven process where the actions of the growers will be reflected in the efficiency of the response, and they can respond accordingly. Does it vary amongst crops? Certainly in the case of the annual crops with large amounts of the nitrogen cycling in the system in the organic matter, that makes life more difficult because the estimations of those recycle nitrogen and the timing of release is important. Irrigation interactions will be discussed by my colleagues. Can organic fertilizers be used? Absolutely. I think there's tremendous potential for more use of organic and dairy waste materials in California agriculture. With that comes complexities of how to manage that. With it comes the economic cost. It is certainly easier and cheaper to buy a bag of fertilizer than 10 tons worth of cow manure and to predict what will occur. However, there, of course, are benefits of having that organic matter added to the soil in terms of soil stability. So finally, certainly high efficiencies can be achieved, but they really are heavily based on the knowledge and the education of the grower, the consultant who's managing. But I think the budgeting, balancing approach, as I said, it's intuitive, it's responsive to management strategies, and it's practical. And I think that's a reasonable approach to addressing these issues. Thank you. Questions?
Yes, members of the board, questions? Bob, yeah.
Just as I think through this, if I were a farmer, if I was like Perry Clausen, of course, I'd be shooting for the perfect number. But a lot of other farmers know, as I understand this, there's the risk of applying too much fertilizer, and that's going to cost you dollars.
Right.
But what that gets you is the risk of applying too low is going to be a poor crop. Is that so? The question to me is that extra dollars that you pay, which can produce, fuller crop, is also an insurance cost to ensure you don't have a poor crop, which may cost you a lot. Is that the kind of calculations that?
Yeah, that has certainly been the calculations been done in a lot of California agriculture, particularly when you recognize the cost of the nitrogen as a proportion of total production
Because
costs.
it's only up to 5%, you said?
7%. And so would you risk putting on 6% versus or 8% to protect yourself?
Exactly.
Indeed, and I think that's what has been occurring. There is, however, a recognition, I think, amongst growers that I speak with and the crop consultants that once they recognize, that's why they were doing what they were doing, there is an awareness that they can cut back and get a bit more specific in addressing if a tenth of the field is hungry, then you need to solve the needs of the tenth of the field and not by applying more to the 100% of the field. And I think that's become more and more recognized as a practical approach. We have some
So
technological
incentives for good management are helpful, but also having regulation to discourage bad management seems part of the issue here.
I think so.
And I think we're going to hear later that particularly in tree crops that over-fertilization can in fact affect tree health, adversely affect
Yeah,
tree
I mean, the
health.
longevity of your tree crops becomes a big issue in that regard, I think, too, doesn't it? Is there information available on the long-term use of excessive nitrogen versus the life of an orchard?
Two attributes there. One, we've certainly done a lot of work and demonstrated that excess nitrogen can increase your disease risk. That's fairly well established. We have trials going on right at this very moment in year 12 addressing that question of high nitrogen, high water, what will it do to the longevity of orchard and the productivity of orchard versus more constrained nitrogen and
Then
water.
you're looking at your lifetime
And we're
cost.
looking at that lifetime. Of course, that, is an almond tree and a walnut orchard, that's a long experiment.
Yeah, we have somebody on this board that knows about that.
Yes.
You mentioned sort of staying up and watching the plant, but what kind of frequency of monitoring should growers look to have as an ideal? I mean, they're not going to be out there checking every day. And in your example saying of almonds, are they out there every week, every couple of weeks, every month? I mean, just an idea.
So in the case of the tree crops, we have been working on some online tools that would have one pre-season estimate of yield based on yield history and known productivity of that plot, a second immediately after flowering, a third at harvest. And so in the almond scenario and likely pistachio and walnut, you're talking 3 or 4 assessments. One of the challenges with doing fewer assessments than more assessments is if you only did 1 or 2, then you only have 1 or 2 adjustment phases. And if you got it wrong for the first 2, you have no room to adjust on the third. So that, I think one of the, if a 70% or a 65% efficiency ratio is established and growers find they cannot maintain productivity with that efficiency ratio, then the question should be, well, where am I going wrong and what can I adjust? Do I need to get out there more often? Do I need to subdivide my fields? So I think the balance approach that Perry Clausen and others have been talking about has that feedback loop in it where a grower can challenge himself with why isn't this working when it should.
Sounds like a development of an app coming up right here. I see it.
I just want to thank you for your presentation. It was a lot of information in a short time, but it was really great. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to get a copy of the presentation so I can spend a little more time looking at it.
You're welcome.
I have a couple questions. I think the statement that you said, and I wrote it down, that you cannot force feed a tree that it's only going to eat what it's hungry for is a very powerful statement. And I'm wondering, I know this presentation has gone out to crop advisors. I'm wondering how much outreach those crop advisors or you or your PhD candidates are doing to growers with that. Certainly with the almond orchard that you showed, half, if you just do some minor tweaking per lot, then you've got a huge efficiency. But then also the statement, I'm wondering how much outreach you have been able to do.
So, we've been doing a lot of outreach with these training programs, so much so that my doctor said, Brown, you're not allowed to talk for the next month. And here I am. And certainly the almond industry, pistachio industry, walnut industry have been very aggressive. Similarly, in the Central Valley, they've been very aggressive with Tim Hart's and Michael Kahn's work as well. The training program that was developed is publicly available for all the CCAs, both for those who've not yet taken the test and those who wish to refresh. And we're working very actively with a number of coalitions and regional growers groups to spread the word as much as possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to reach out to CCAs, but sometimes growers don't always believe they're CCAs. And so some direct data to them is also very helpful. And then my other question, I think, probably goes to Pamela, but maybe you can answer it as well. The nitrogen budgeting that we're going to be asking growers to do, will that be a block by block basis where will growers, when they're doing their budgeting for the year, be able to look at, their 40-acre block and their 40-acre block and adjust as
That's a Clay question.
Clay or
a
Joe?
A Joe question, excuse me.
Yes, I think there are a couple of different issues, right, in terms of the nitrogen management plan and then the reporting. And so, and that's something we're still going to be working on. We're waiting for the results from the expert panel to help advise us on how best to track and report. So, and part of our hope, and I think that this is true of with Doug and the CDFA putting the training together for the CCAs, is to do something that makes sense for the growers, and then so that they can do the best job possible, and then use that information. We consolidate. If you remember, there's that sort of pyramid we talked about at the last meeting, so that we get the information we need so we can look at what's going on overall. So the bottom line is, whatever is going to work best for the growers in terms of developing that nitrogen management plan is what we'd like to see. As far as what the order says, it's it's crop specific or it's property specific. So we're looking for that at sort of a minimum. And like what Patrick was saying is, even in the way we have it set up is you could potentially have a grower that say has a lot of acres, hundreds of acres, and the way we've set up is we've actually said, well, if you're doing the same sort of practices everywhere, you could report it that way. Now what he's saying is that may not really make sense, and that may not be in the best interest of the grower to really do things that consistently between their different fields.
Yeah, and it'd be hard as a grower to harvest in 40-acre blocks and separate out the blocks, the yields from each of those as well.
We do have Alan Fulton who will be speaking to monitoring.
Yeah, and so what we're trying to be careful of is we're trying to be careful in the order is not to really direct things in a way that would really tell the farmer how to farm, but trying to get more at what's the potential impact of those practices on groundwater quality. And so that's why there really is a lot of flexibility at this point in how to design the templates, both the nitrogen management plan template as well as the nitrogen management plan summary report, which would be the information that comes to us.
Great, thank you.
Okay, are there any further questions for Professor Brown before we move on?
Do you have the list of those questions that you said Pamela had wrote out?
I have 5 of the 9
Okay,
were on
because I
that.
have 7, on number 7.
And some of
You
the
have that
addition. I don't, but go ahead. I can remember it. I'm
I
pretty sure.
believe that Dr. Parker could speak more to that
Okay.
question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hey, this is a really exciting presentation. I'm really into it. This is really good.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're not litigating either.
Makes a lawyer want to be a professor.
Good morning, members of the board, ladies and gentlemen. It's nice to be here today. I thought with the short period of time that I had today.
Sir, introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, Dan Monk, UC Cooperative Extension Farm Advisor.
Great.
Irrigation Soils and Cotton Farm Advisor. And today I thought with the time that I had, I'd try to provoke just a few ideas about some of the issues and existing management tools that we're using to help minimize some of the deeper movements of nitrogen or potential for deeper movements in nitrogen in the soil, and thereby improving or the opportunities for increased or improving our groundwater quality situation. So let's see. Okay, there we go. So in doing that, I thought I'd break the talk up into about 4 different areas. I thought I'd talk in terms of timing during the season. I'd talk a little bit about the pre and early season nitrogen management issues and concerns, and just highlight a couple of issues there. Then move to some in-season concerns and practices
Dan,
that might be useful.
Dan, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you have to scoot a little. We record all of our board meetings.
Okay.
So you need to speak to this microphone more.
And then talk a little bit about nitrogen application timing and irrigation practices, which certainly can have an impact on the movement and mobility of nitrogen in the soil. And I'll finalize that with just some general comments about irrigation systems and some of the water management concerns. So one of the things that I studied early on in my career, and we do see this in our agricultural production systems, is high infiltration rates and the problem that presents in some cases, particularly with surface irrigated systems. So we're talking about furrow and flood types of systems. And the thing that we sometimes forget is that each irrigation event, particularly in the surface irrigated systems, is different from another. And they actually do follow a general trend line in which very early season, even winter pre-irrigation events, are probably the highest infiltration rates of the season. And what that means is we're applying a lot of water, and not all of it might not be being stored in the soil, and therefore these are actually opportunities, I think, for leaching to occur, but also opportunities by growers to manage those systems. So we think of these events or periods of time when the system is more manageable. What are some of the things that growers are doing to combat that issue or problem? Well, there's been a lot of movement to reducing the run lengths of irrigation runs. So if you shorten up those runs, you basically have that water will reach the end of the furrow, or the end of the flooded system much quicker, and you'll apply a lot less water. You'll actually have a more efficient and more uniform irrigation. Similarly, if you increase the flow rate, this is another method and approach that's been used to limit that. And we've seen transitioning systems over the years where growers have actually, where this has been a real problem, high infiltration rates have been a problem. We've moved to things like sprinkler pre-irrigation, where hand-moved sprinklers, in the case of annual cropping systems, have been used to limit and actually apply a more specific amount of water, as opposed to just having it fall back onto surface infiltration rates as being the controlling factor. And then obviously we've also seen a lot of transition in more recent years in moving these, just changing the system altogether, moving away from furrow and flood systems to pressurized systems such as sprinkler, and a lot of drip irrigation has been installed. So the other issue that is of particular concern early in the season is the impact of residual nitrogen concentration in surface soils. Now, in some soils, there's actually fairly low nitrate levels are maintained throughout the season, particularly in some of the like tree and fruit crops, for instance. Grapes are another example where high residual nitrogen contents just are not present. However, in many of the annual cropping systems, and even in some of the permanent cropping systems, we do see significant amounts of nitrates in soils that have been left over from the previous season. These can be measured. Pre-plant nitrogen tests and pre-side dress nitrogen tests are fairly common. They're being used, and they help identify the amount of nitrogen that's in the soil already at the beginning or in season to help allow us to support a good nitrogen recommendation. They're relatively low cost, and they don't have a huge time requirement, and so these are practical approaches to nitrogen management. And they certainly support the nitrogen balance approach that's being developed and implemented and supported by the coalitions. To give you a little bit of an example, in the case of annual cropping systems, I thought I'd show you that there is a wide variation in some of the residual soil nitrate levels in soils. In some of these systems, they've been rotated. For instance, in the Merced County system here, this is a cotton study that was done in the late 1990s. In the Merced County system, for instance, we were rotating from a vegetable crop and into cotton. And some of these other systems, we had various different rotations. Some of these are cotton rotations. Some of these are rotated from wheat or other vegetable crops, alfalfa. And this gives you a sense for the fact that, one, residual nitrate can play a very important role in supporting new crop or current crop year nitrogen needs, but that it's also highly variable, and therefore we need, it's an important component and something vital, I think, to measure in our management systems. So to sort of summarize a couple of the comments there, for leaky systems, that is systems that we have high infiltration rates and the potential for deep water movement, there are opportunities to identify these infiltration specific events. They may not be a problem throughout the season that lead to deep leaching, but it's also difficult to directly measure infiltration rates in soils. Residual nitrogen concentrations in the surface soil can be significant, and the measuring of that nitrate, especially in annual cropping systems, is a key component to a nitrogen management system. High residual nitrate, however, with over-application of water can lead to the degradation and deep movement of nitrogen, leading to groundwater degradation. But there's also many systems out there that have fairly low residual nitrogen levels, and over-application of water is not as much of a concern when it comes to water quality concerns. It's also an element of recharge, and that's been an important component over the years that we've recognized and can help balance the groundwater management in a sub-watershed. So some of the in-season nitrogen issues and practices that I thought I'd bring to the attention is keeping up with crop nitrogen demand. And this follows some of Professor Brown's discussion on the timing. And timing can be very critical, and this illustration is that of corn, in which very high rates of nitrogen over a very short period of time are required. Up to about 10 pounds of nitrogen per day are consumed during that period between about 8 leaf and early tasseling of corn, where about 40% of the nitrogen is used over a very short period of time. So timing and rate are very critical for all crops, but this just sort of emphasizes an example where very high rates of nitrogen are required over a very short period of time. So keeping up with, in terms of keeping up with the nitrogen demand, each crop does have a specific demand for nitrogen. There is a yield-dependent component of this. I think Dr. Brown already really addressed that, and I think that that needs to be a consideration. It also allows us for some in-season management where we might actually go out and evaluate yield potential and then make some changes in our earlier recommendations that occurred early in the season. New tools are becoming available in terms of the nitrogen balance of the system, and tools like USDA developed NLEAP, and then we're actually looking at some new tools with UC Cooperative Extension on nitrogen management. And this is just an example of some of the output that comes from Marcia Campbell Matthews' program, where she's looking at forage systems, and where basically there's been an identification of specific crop needs and crop requirements. Let me go back on, oops, not sure if I can, there we go. So there's basically what we have a demand component of the model. We have basically there's a supply side element of this. We're looking at irrigation water inputs, and we also have in this model we've incorporated irrigation events that have nitrate and groundwater summarized, and we can see that the timing of irrigations and the amount of irrigations are being simulated in this example, and basically giving us a good reporting and a management tool to assist us in better utilizing the timing and amounts of nitrogen in that system. Plant monitoring is also something that we're doing in season. It's not available for all crops, but there are a number of crops where we do have good guidelines that represent significant acreage out there. Petiole testing and leaf blade testing of nitrogen mid-season, early to mid-season, can be an important part of nitrogen management in our systems, and they are being utilized. Perhaps the development could be improved and increased on a number of crops, but this can be an important element of in-season nitrogen practices. So basically, to reiterate, each crop does have a very specific period of nitrogen demand, and with very high rates of uptake over relatively short periods of time. And then nitrogen budgeting estimates are available for many of the key Central Valley crops. Monitoring of nitrogen content in plant tissues does offer a positive tool for many of these crops, and guidelines have been developed but need to be developed for additional crops. And I'd like to finally talk a little bit about the application of nitrogen during irrigation events. And I thought I'd pull an example of some work that was done by Dr. Larry Schwankel on the Davis campus, who looked at liquid sulfur. He basically dripped it in the irrigation water on these surface irrigated, basically furrow irrigated systems. And the idea was to figure out, what is the most efficient timing of applying that material during the irrigation event. And so basically he applied the liquid sulfur at different periods of time. Sometimes initially, as soon as that water started, he'd apply that liquid sulfur, and then at various times later on during the irrigation event in other treatments. And in this example that I'm showing here, the liquid sulfur drip was applied at about 750, when the furrow had advanced about 750 feet on a 1,000-foot run, and by the time it reached 850 feet, that sulfur had already caught up to the end of the field. just to give you an idea of how this experiment went. Well, the bottom line of all of this is that basically if you apply the materials during the entire irrigation event, this provided the least, the most non-uniform application of nutrient as opposed to applying that nutrient much later in the irrigation event. So the guideline here that's been developed is to basically move beyond, make sure that water moves beyond the 75% mark up to the 85% mark, and you'll increase the uniformity of application. So again, an example of a tool that can be used to help improve the uniformity of fertilizer applications. There's been some additional work, some parallel work, if you will, over in Jan Hotman's lab, where they looked at modeling the system and the impact of fertigation timing on nitrate uptake by tree systems. And what they found here is basically they did the same kind of idea. They applied the nitrogen in a 24-hour irrigation set for the first three hours, and then subsequent 3-hour applications later on to see how that might impact the movement of that nitrogen in that irrigation event. And what they found was basically that if you front load or put the nitrogen on very early in the irrigation event, you tended to have much more deep movement, and that's what you see there in that orange figure down at the bottom there in the 0 to 3 hour segment. Basically shows you higher concentrations of nitrate much lower in the soil profile, as opposed to waiting or delaying that application of nutrient until later in the irrigation event, where you tended to have much lower levels of nitrates down deep. And of course, this is so if we're addressing the question of whether or not the timing and the rate of nitrogen injection affect the movement of nitrogen in soil, the answer is yes, absolutely. And that applications move to the later part of the irrigation in both of these systems led to a more shallow placement of nitrogen, where the root uptake tends to be much more improved and deep movement of nitrogen minimized. The nice thing about this type of a practice is it really doesn't cost any additional time. It doesn't cost additional resources. It's just a good management practice that's available out there. So to kind of sum things up briefly, there is a connection, certainly a connection between the irrigation management practices and the nitrogen movement in soils. It's identifying some of these events or periods of time when we're doing re-wetting, for instance, in some of our permanent crop systems where we have low volume irrigation. Some of those events that might be targeted as in terms of times or opportunities where deep leaching might be occurring, those would be opportunities to look further into the possibility of deep leaching of nitrogen. But not all of these leaky systems degrade groundwater quality. Nitrogen management plans and the budgeting approaches that are being proposed include the measurement of residual soil nitrate, and I feel that that's one of the key elements in many of the systems that we look at in our agricultural systems. This is a key component to the nitrogen balance. Certainly not the only component. Dr. Brown addressed a couple of the other important elements, certainly irrigation water. That can be a very significant element. And also mineralized nitrogen residual from a previous crop is a key element as well. Some of the new computer management models can be useful as an educational tool, practical nitrogen budgeting tools, but we do need more experience, and we need to work with them more. They're very good educational tools. I think they're also useful. Some of these, the way they're being developed, are good management tools as well that can be used while conducting operations in various individual fields. There are also known nitrogen practices, identified a couple of them here, that require a little effort and cost to result in reduced potential for deep movement of nitrates. So with that, I'll conclude my comments unless there are questions.
Very interesting, Dan. Separate from this workshop, I'd like to talk to you about the mathematical modeling, but that could go on for a long time. Okay. Are there any questions or comments? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Alan Fulton, farm advisor up in Tehama County, and I work in serve the areas of Tehama, Glenn, Colusa, and western Shasta County. Give me a second here, and I'll find my presentation. Let's see. There it is. Okay, so among our team today, I have the task of speaking to record keeping and reporting to gauge efficient nitrogen management. I believe this was your question number 9 in the list that was submitted to us. Questions about what kind of information do we need to
Excuse me, could you speak up just a little bit for our system? Thank you.
Okay. So basically the question of what kinds of information do we need to judge good nitrogen management on a individual farm basis. So this is a subject that is a little different from the rest of the subject that we've spoken about this morning, in the sense it's not something that we've researched, okay? And I'm going to draw a little bit from my own participation in the California Department of Food and Ag task force that recently completed. And to be honest, in a little bit I'm going to just have to relay my own professional opinion, and we can work with it from there, okay? So as I think about record keeping and reporting information so we can gauge nitrogen use efficiency, I see two challenges come to mind for me. We need effective reporting that can be done with limited time, personnel, and money, and I think that's true from a regulatory point of view, and it's true from the ag community point of view that is being regulated. I think we have some shared common objectives. We want to protect the groundwater quality, and we want to sustain productive farming. And in order to do that, we need to come up with a reporting process that works smart, concentrates on areas with the most potential benefit to both groundwater quality and to sustaining our farming industry. And along these lines, in my own mind, I think there's some potential pitfalls. And one is attempting to accomplish too much too fast when faced with a large-scale non-point source issue like we have. I personally am concerned about too much reporting that generates too many records to compile and interpret, whether it's the third-party coalition group that's compiling and interpreting or your staff. And in the end, it creates delays or maybe dysfunction within your own regulatory efforts. So now I'm going to kind of switch over to the kinds of information that's available that can contribute to reporting, and maybe where it fits into the question of when to report it, kind of thing. And the first couple items, about the next 4 slides, are going to be things that you've probably already thought about some. I'm sorry, I'll step up here closer. But we've heard discussions about the nitrogen hazardous index. If you're not familiar with it, at the very bottom bullet is a website that the University of California offers. It's a pretty simple, concise discussion I bring to your attention. But in essence, it's a process that was, one of the first times it was proposed was by the Natural Resource Council as far back as 1993. And it's a process to identify and give priority to the most vulnerable areas for groundwater contamination, in this case nitrate. And what its attempt to do is to start to meld together different scientific disciplines. And if you look at the bullet there, you kind of have your hydrologic sciences. It attempts to look at the setting, the ag setting, from a hydrologic perspective. Changes in climate, your soils, the hydraulic conductivity, depth to water table, and it can be refined many different ways. Then the next bullet down kind of offers the agronomic perspective. It's the crops we're growing, how we rotate them. Are they high nitrogen users? Are they not? Are they deep rooting crops or shallow rooting crops? And again, we're trying to meld these disciplines together, and it brings in some of the engineering discipline as well, about irrigation design, irrigation methods. And what this index is doing is starting to match them up. Do we have good methods with the right soils, with the right crops? And what it helps us do is identify where the areas are that are greatest risk, and also where there's areas that we can continue to do effective leaching, because we do know that leaching is important to maintaining our groundwater levels, our groundwater supply reliability. So probably the goal isn't to totally eliminate leaching, it's to eliminate leaching where nitrate can be carried with it. So in essence, this index assigns a risk rate, 1 generally low and going to over 20. And what I would add to it is this nitrogen hazard index was developed both in public sector, but it's been taken and refined and used within the private sector. And so it's certainly a place, a tool, and type of information that we can be looking at. And just a few more things on the nitrogen hazardous index. Right now, to my understanding so far, it does look like it's being incorporated into use for the irrigated lands program purposes, but tending to be a little more at this point at the watershed scale or sub-watershed scale. And if you read into it a little bit, you'll find some of the UC experts, particularly the Riverside campus, have suggested that maybe there's a point it's more appropriate at the farm level. So incorporating the nitrogen hazardous index is an important tool to working smart and efficiently, and the nature of this reporting is a relatively infrequent. Once the index is established, it's a relatively infrequent reporting process, unless you're working in a highly vulnerable area and you start making improvements and you want to see how that assessment changes. So
I'd like to make a couple observations at this point. I think it's an important tool, as you pointed out, but it's simply one of many. You mentioned that maybe it was Riverside folks talking about it should be used at the farm level, and I think, as we've seen again today, it's probably at the field level and maybe even at the subfield level, because if you don't move that nitrogen out of the root zone, you're not, in other words, if you don't leach it down farther, you basically don't have a problem as far as water quality is concerned. It's there for future years, which really gets back to the whole issue of, and I should have asked Dan about this, the importance of irrigation and irrigation monitoring insofar as possibly use of moisture, soil moisture probes, and how important is knowing how much water you're putting on each part of the field, given soil types and so forth. How important is really maintaining your drip system if you're going drip, because there's been a lot of criticism on water use efficiency of furrow and flood. It was pointed out that the surge irrigation technologies can get around a lot of this with short runs, but there's been drip systems out there with only a 30% uniformity just due to poor maintenance. So all of these factors enter in, and when you go to one big gross management system like this, it's a good tool, but it's only a tool. Would you agree with that?
I would agree. I'm actually going to speak to a little bit about some of the methods you touched on.
Thank you.
Okay, so it's just one piece that's out there, one of the kinds of pieces of information, and it seems to have a place in this. The next thing is the nitrogen management plans, which Dr. Brown essentially walked you through some examples, and this has been discussed many times. The coalitions seem on board and as a practical tool. And the frequency appears to be somewhat on an annual kind of track, and might be influenced by the vulnerability levels associated within different watersheds and such. And as he pointed out, I've just highlighted the 4 R's again here that the nitrogen budget gets at. And I'll just emphasize the last bullet, the last R, the right end fertilizer placement and the influences of irrigation. So if we work through a nitrogen budget and the rate, the timing, and the source look right, but we still see a high proportion of applied fertilizer to what we think our research base says the crop demand is, this starts to point out too, well, that maybe the nitrogen practice itself is not the limiting factor, and maybe there is an interaction with irrigation. So let's see if I can get this moved. So another advantage of the nitrogen management plan as a tool along with the nitrogen hazard index is it seeks to, it's a way being proposed right now that we can map and we can see the current levels, we can see progress, we can identify outliers and know where to begin to concentrate our efforts. And I think an important piece to this, I think it can be complementary to your groundwater quality trend monitoring that's been proposed, and help by seeing the current management plans. If the current management plans look reasonable, but you're still seeing issues with groundwater quality, it helps start to distinguish this question between practices now and legacy effects from practices many years ago. So, the part I guess I really need to get to is the connection between the nitrogen and irrigation management. When I participated in the task force, there was a lot of question: can you track nitrogen and not pay more attention to the water management? And the fact is that irrigation management influences nitrogen management efficiency. So we wrestled with the question, so what about record keeping and reporting for irrigation management practices? And this is where I'm going to kind of get into my own opinion here a little bit. If detailed record keeping and reporting of irrigation management practices were required, the Irrigated Lands Program could find itself on the verge of excessive reporting and could lead to dysfunction. I think there might be a time and place if you can kind of drill down through your process and find your most vulnerable areas. There may be a time and place where there's maybe more need for reporting on irrigation, and I'll try to explain why I have this opinion. Growers at the farm level have different tools that they can turn to make their water management decisions, to judge when to irrigate and how much water to apply. They can do a water budget that's kind of similar to a nitrogen budget. They can monitor soil moisture levels, and we have tools to detect crop stress, or we can use some combination of the three. And I think one of the places we're going to want to be looking for is information that if they're not using any kind of scientific tools. Okay, so I want to just give you a little background on the kinds of the approaches and methods that growers are using, and what I hope to give you is a sense of the kind of the level of detail that's there, and if you had to report it, the volume of data and types of things it would create. So the first is a water budget, which is simply creating an estimate of the water use over the season and as it accumulates over the course of the season, and comparing it to the water supply from irrigation, from your effective rainfall, which can be highly variable depending on where you are at in the Central Valley. To get at these estimates of crop water use, many of us have heard of the CIMMYS program, California Irrigation Management Information System. It's a network of standardized weather stations. This is a photo of one showing it's standardized. It's measuring the evaporative demand on a grass surface. So the thing we have to do to apply this real-time weather, we have to then convert it, relate it to a different crop. In this case, I used walnut because that's what I work for. And a walnut orchard looks very different than a grass crop or a grass pasture. So we develop crop coefficients, and what this table shows an example of crop coefficients for walnut, and what it is an adjustment to the grass reference measured with the weather station for the change in canopy over the course of the season. And this is just a series of slides from our late leafing Chandler variety just starting to break dormancy, and then moving through the canopy. And it's just trying to show you here the idea behind the crop coefficient. In the end, if I'm using a water budget, I'm relating the real-time estimates of water use by the crop for the specific season to how my irrigation system performs. And I have a weekly estimate from what I think the weather weather demand on ET was, and I have an irrigation system that I know is designed a certain way or runs a certain way to put out a certain amount of water. I'm running them to strike a balance. and also account for soil storage that might be in the profile from the winter rains, or in the case further north, the rains we're getting as the crops are growing, kind of thing. So this is just an example here. This is kind of a water budget for one field, one almond orchard, and there's a little bit of detail there. And so again, the reason I'm going through this is to give you a feel for the kind of work that's going on, that can be going on behind the scene, and how it's going to be a challenge if you were to try to capture that level of detail. Okay, so that's the water budget approach. Some of the most popular methods.
Yeah, excuse me.
Yeah.
Can you summarize, because we're running out of time here?
Okay. Okay, I got about 4 or 5 more slides. Okay, so one of the more popular methods is the soil moisture sensors. Here on the right, you can see a sample set of data for one field. And then we have a technique for crop stress detection, and you can see how we can take crop stress measurements and relate it and make decisions about irrigation. So the growers can have this kind of information, and when you go to trying to figure out how to report water management type stuff, the point is, the main point I want to make here is the second bullet. There is more than one scientific perspective that can be used to guide irrigation management decisions, and to attempt and report them will generate a diverse and enormous amount and type of data. And I'll just end with the very last point here. Will the effort to go to this level of reporting be useful or overwhelming? And so
Yeah, I think you may misunderstand what we want on reporting, what stays at the farm, and all of that. This is very important. We don't have the time to go into it. It could take the rest of the day.
Okay.
Pamela, we need to come back on this particular issue, focus in on this particular issue at another workshop. Like I said earlier, you know, you have to make efforts to retain it in the root zone. What does it take to do that? The second part of that is you're going to have to, and we're not even touching on here, is you have to have periodic leaching in some areas to get salts out of the root zone. So we could spend half a day on just more than that on this topic. Are there any quick questions? We'll move on. Thank you very much, sir. You've opened up the Pandora's box, and we're going to proceed in another workshop, I hope, to address this further.
Dr. Longley, if we could have Dr. Parker come back up and
Sure.
speak to
Doug?
Sandra's question, that might be.
Yeah, just real briefly on the sort of the economics and the costs of it. There are not a lot of studies out there on what would be the cost. You can see sort of the different variety of possible management options that people might face. I know that back in the Harder report, some economics was done on the cost of some of the BMP type of management systems, but to get down to the farm level of, say, you know, dividing your furrows in half, you know, lengths, you have to look at what are the labor costs of this, what kind of equipment costs. Do I even have the ability to supply water in that way? How is my water delivered from the water district? So it gets quite complex. So we really don't have a whole lot of answer in terms of the economic costs of it, because it's very specific to the farm. I think in a lot of these studies, when they are doing, you know, when Patrick's looking at different irrigation systems, you know, they are calculating the cost as part of those. But then the question is, how representative is it across different farms? And certainly by crop type, it's going to vary as well.
What I also, the example is the impacts on drinking water quality, in other words, the uses of nutrient receiving waters.
Pardon me?
That was part of the question.
What was the impact on receiving waters?
The impacts on drinking water quality and other uses of nutrient receiving waters.
Yeah, so I guess these different practices and stuff that are designed to sort of hold those nutrients in the root zone or make sure they get to the crops are designed to help improve drinking water quality, in the sense that if you're keeping that nitrogen where the crop can use it and you're making sure the crop is using it, you're reducing the amount that can be pushed down either into groundwater or running off into surface waters, depending on what type of a system you're in.
Thank you.
Does that help? Sure.
Any further questions? Thank you very much, Doug, and I think we want to keep talking.
Yeah, I just want to thank the panel also for your contributions.
Thank you. we will take a 5-minute break. Be back in here at 11:25, and I'll hold you to the time this time because we're short on time. It will continue with the blue cards at that point. Go. We're not done with the item. We're just taking a break. We got 4 of us here. 3 of us.
The other 2 are coming.
Yeah. I have some cards. We'll start with, and I have, please excuse me, Mary, but a card from Mary Zhonghire. Okay, it says no, good, okay. But how did I do on your name? John Dickey. And then it's Bruce.
So push the
That's
button.
not on.
Thanks, sir. Good morning. Thank you for the chance to address the board briefly. I just have kind of 3 comments on the preceding presentations. The first is that as an as a certified crop advisor agronomist, I recently was one of the 500 students that Cooperative Extension ran through their end management training program. The training was excellent by any measure I know of. It focused on retention and use of nitrogen to grow crops and minimization of nitrate losses to groundwater. It showed that they've put years of agronomic and farmer behavior research into place in preparation for being able to do this. That informed all the work they've kind of presented to the CCAs and the tools that they kind of rolled out. So can't say enough good things about that work. To Mr. Schneider's question, to Patrick Brown, and I'm going to paraphrase, please interrupt me if I get it wrong. Since there's no downside to over-fertilization and a real economic downside to under-fertilization, aren't farmers prone to over-fertilization? Am I close?
I think that left out a few of the qualifiers, but we'll let it go at that.
All right. I want to get it right. So, I'm not critical of the question, but just I think, Patrick's answer, of course, was reasonable for a lot of crops, but, the focus of his presentation was permanent crops. In annual crops, as well as perhaps some permanent crops, there are real downsides to over-fertilization. There are economic downsides, not only the purchase of fertilizer, but a decline in yield and quality that takes place. And this is the case for rice. I'm here with the California Rice Commission today. You over-fertilize rice, you delay maturity, you end up with rice plants potentially falling over. They're exposed to cold weather when they wouldn't be. You get blanking, so reductions in yield and quality ensue. Furthermore, rice farmers already subdivide their fields, not exactly as Patrick showed, but in another way. Cold water significantly influences the production of rice in the inlet areas, especially in the northern zone of rice country. And those areas are not fertilized. And they're not fertilized because the double whammy of the cold water and the rice delaying maturity results in a real impact to their loads in terms of quality, so they just stay out of them. Probably significantly improves their nitrogen use efficiency, as Patrick suggested. Also, I just note that the economic, environmental, and regulatory downsides outside of yield impacts that happen are increasingly felt by farmers. They're not without knowledge of what we're talking about here today. Lastly, just a general comment on especially I think the last presentation. I think the economic, the focus on the improved management just described by cooperative extension holds far greater potential for protecting groundwater than any amount of centralized nitrogen accounting. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for your comments, sir. Questions?
No, but I want to reframe my question.
Reframe your question.
Since I got not exactly quoted, but you know, I asked a provocative hypothetical question or put that forth, but in terms of framing this question, I do want to emphasize, and many have heard me say this, that we're fortunate in this state to have a whole host of farmers who deeply care about the land, they care about the people, and they certainly care about nitrogen issues or herbicide, pesticide issues in our waterways. And I think over the last 10 years, to the extent we've seen a lot of those issues actually addressed, is indicative of exactly that sentiment. So, thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Another example, by the way, is grapes. Obviously, if you give grapes excess nutrients late in the season, they'll keep putting on foliage and no fruit. And I like my wine, and I like it when they put on good fruit. Bruce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bruce
And
Hausschultz.
next will be Tim.
Sac River Valley Water Quality Coalition to be. I'll be very brief. You have a lot of important decisions before you today and a very full agenda. I just wanted to go to Vice Chairman Moffitt's comment about getting the word out to the growers. Happened to be at the Almond Board earlier this week at their sustainability program where they were doing a lot of these conversations. There were growers there. I gave a presentation on what the new WDR member requirements would be. So certainly the word is getting out to the growers. This is terrific work. I echo what John Dickey said. This is terrific work. I'm working with our 13 sub-watersheds on how we're going to be having educational meetings on things like the member requirements and this. Of course, the foundational element to all of this is the groundwater quality assessment. And so I think the mutually beneficial result of everything is to keep this, as Alan said in one of his early slides, was the key to success here is starting simple and building and keeping it focused where you need, prioritization, and then certainly in the MRPs it allows for that to occur. So I just want to compliment the panel today. I think they provide valuable information. These are always processes that are works in progress, and we always learn by having a good, respectful, and responsible conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Tim?
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, I'm Tim Johnson, President and CEO of the California Rice Commission. To appreciate the presentation today, I thought it was very good information. I'd just like to provide you some very broad context. Actually, both Perry and David Corey gave me the authority to speak for them, so I'm going to do that quite well, I hope.
That's quite an honor, Tim.
If it gets bad, it's just their fault. I think that what you saw today was exactly the kind of information that many of us has come before this board and told you existed. Great research from UC, great tools in UC Extension, backed up by decades of understanding at a crop level basis. We've known that information has been available, and you've seen that today. Really, the context is we need to be able to take that information and overlay it then with the coalition efforts. That will do two things. That will allow us to take the practices that you heard about today, apply them in the areas where they're needed, and be able to apply them specifically to the crops as they would be adapted. And it's really the coalitions and the individual crops, right, the commodity groups and boards that will be able to assist the coalitions in providing that application of this really great UC and extension research right down to the ground where it's needed. It will be different. It will be different by crop. It'll be different by crop region. But it's that specific application, that taking the big picture that you saw and drilling it right down to rice grown in Colusa County, maybe on the west side of the river, that will be important to improving water quality. And I would just like to pick up, Chairman Longley, your comment. I think additional dialogue before this board would be great. A workshop would be ideal. Bring the coalitions in, bring some of the commodity boards in to be able to help you understand how we'll take this information and really drill it down to real on-the-ground application, or in those areas where we know we need to do that. Because that, at the end of the day, is what we're all thinking as we look to implement the new WDRs. And so I just wanted to be able to provide you that perspective and that context. There really is no silver bullet. There certainly are some regulatory requirements with regard, reporting certain elements, et cetera, but really there are many silver bullets that are going to be, need to be addressed on a region by region, crop by crop basis. So just be careful what you think you might have heard, which is, one thing's going to fix all the nitrogen issues in ag in California. I think the practical reality is we can do that, but it'll be with slightly different and more focused approach. Thank you.
Different kinds of silver bullets.
Tim?
Thank you, Tim.
Maybe I should ask the panel, but or we'll let it go for now. But if you have nitrogen at a 70% efficiency, which is pretty good, what's going on with the other 30%?
Sure. I think it varies by crop. I can tell you that I know the answer to that question for rice, and if I don't know the specifics, I can go and find it out. And I think that's a perfect example, Bob, that question is answerable, but it's not going to be answerable at the aggregate. It's going to be answerable going to that crop in that region and those management practices and answering that. In the case of rice, we know that when we take the water off our field a couple of times during the season, that you're going to lose that to gas. And we know that because we've spent 3 years working on that with the Air Resources Board. But those answers to those questions either are knowable or there may have been research and work already done in that regard. Importantly, it doesn't mean, right, that nitrogen goes to groundwater. It may not make the Air Board real happy, and it may not make me really happy in that boardroom. But with regard to the issues of this board,
I think my question really goes to what you're talking about. It's a multimedia question. It involves our social construct with our value of rural communities. It goes to the air quality issues. It goes to the research and science we need to do. And I guess my point is we can't all solve them in this room with this board, but I appreciate your approach. Those are questions we can ask and that we can look for answers for.
If I could just follow up, increasingly I see not just rice, but my colleagues in every commodity group coming before their researchers and coming before their boards and saying we need to manage the wholeness of our impacts. And really looking at that interrelatedness as well, because at the end of the day, to be successful in California, it's not just the water board we have to meet your requirements and have those engagements, but the air board as well as other contexts. And so really don't know anybody that's just looking at it one issue at a time. We're really working to try and provide solutions across the board.
And if
I
you
do
look,
like my rice.
That's right. And if you look at that diagram show the nitrogen cycle that was put up. Some of that, of course, also goes into next year's nitrogen budget, hopefully. But we want to minimize what goes to groundwater at the same time, which we'll be talking about later, I guess. You, in fact, have to have some leaching if you're going to control salt within the root zone. So it's complex, it's difficult, and something we'll be talking about later.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you,
Thank
Bob,
you for your comments. Any further questions or comments?
I have just
Yes.
one. I really liked the presentation, and I think that in addition to thanking the panel, I'll tell Pamela that it's just such an A-plus group that you found, so thank you.
I have to thank Doug Parker.
Yeah, no, it's really impressive. But I did, during the break, found out that there's a lot of interest from growers to see this kind of presentation. And so even though this kind of presentation can't accommodate them in person. If there was a way that this was somehow, recorded and then just, recorded sounds so VCR, I don't mean recorded, but, was available for people to watch online, and then maybe you have, whatever many hours, and then you got the person who's a specialist in that crop in the room, to meet with that sort of commodity group to sort of drill down. But anyways, it just seemed like there was so much interest, and just given limitations on space and time, they had to limit it. But it's a great presentation and a lot of interest.
It was great, and there are times when we actually bring in a videotape and record it and then make it available online. I didn't think to do that here, but we can do that in the future.
Yes, Doug?
Yeah, just a quick response. From our trainings that we did do, the day-and-a-half trainings, we did video them. I'm turning that into a verb. The trainings at one site, and those are being put up on the website for the people who are training, but it is a public website. It's not password protected. In addition, the PowerPoints that we did for those trainings are all being annotated, and those will be up on the website. In this coming year, we will be talking about how do we want to do trainings next year, and looking at more web delivery of this type of information. So hopefully that will be coming out, and they'll be doing press releases when this kind of information becomes available. But again, it'll be at different levels of complexity for people.
And what website are you talking about?
I don't have it off the top of my head. I can get it for the
We
board.
can do a link from our website to their website so that people have it accessible. I mean, I really wanted to focus, it's really important that we help reach out to the growers, but I'm also trying to help educate the regulators on the complexities and issues, and that's really important as well, that the education goes both ways.
Yeah, and thank you.
We have a card from Perry Klassen.
I won't bring it all the way. Perry Clausen, East San Joaquin Coalition. I just wanted to let you know that we are planning a major outreach effort. When we get this nitrogen budgeting process settled, because once that's settled, we are going to do a multimedia VCR video, whatever they call it nowadays, of these presentations, because we are challenged with having all of our members do an outreach, participate in an outreach. You've heard this over and over in the WDRs. This is going to be one of the major components of our outreach. With irrigation management, we don't want to get into reporting, but these are things that we are absolutely going to be doing effectively, broadly. Bruce was talking about one meeting. I anticipate dozens and dozens, both live and also doing these on video, because our members need to understand this. And it needs to be specific to peaches and pomegranates and rice, and this was very broad. We need to do it down at the crop level and at the region level. So I just let you know.
There seems to be some misconception on reporting. You'll be covering that too?
Oh, yes,
Yes, very
certainly.
good.
But I mean, the agronomy that you heard today,
Right.
yes, we certainly plan to do. I just wanted to let you know that's going to be the case.
Thank you. Any further questions or comments, members of the board? And thank you, Perry, for the addition. Thank you all for coming out today. It was informative. There's a lot of interest, and this is just the beginning. So with that, we'll move on to agenda item 7, Eastern San Joaquin's River Watershed Irrigated Land, WDRs. This is the time and place for a hearing to consider revision of the general waste discharge requirements for growers within the Eastern San Joaquin River watershed that are members of the third-party group. Is there anyone present who is contesting the proposed action and wishes to present evidence or testimony on this matter? I see nobody. Good. Since there is no one present to contest this matter, the board will proceed based on the agenda materials and the record. Are there any late revisions or staff comments?
No, there are not.
There are none. Okay. Does council have any legal issues?
I do not.
He has none. The hearing is now closed. The chair will entertain a motion to revise the general waste discharge requirements. Do I have a motion?
I so move.
Jenny moves.
I'll second that.
Bob seconds. All in favor, state, is there any discussion? All in favor state so by saying aye. Opposed say no. Abstentions? Motion carries. Takes us to item number 8. Sacramento Valley Rice Growers Irrigated Lands WDRs. This is time and place for a hearing to consider adoption of the general waste discharge requirements for the Sacramento Valley rice growers. Is there anyone present who is contesting the proposed action and wishes to present evidence or testimony on this matter? Well, Tim, you told me you wanted to say a few things. If you don't raise your hand, we're going to close the hearing. You want to make a few comments?
I have a presentation, Mr. Chairman, that we have provided to your staff. I believe that's...
Okay, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead, but I'm going to ask staff to keep their comments very, very short, and I'm going to ask Tim to do likewise. Okay. Since there are persons present wishing to contest this item, we'll proceed with the hearing. I'm not so sure it's being contested as much as people want to present additional evidence. This hearing will be conducted in accordance with the notice of public hearing and the meeting procedures published with the meeting agenda. This time, evidence should be introduced on whether the proposed action should be taken. All persons expecting to testify, please stand at this time, raise your right hand, and take the following oath. Do you swear the testimony you're about to give is the truth? If so, answer, I do.
I do.
Interested persons shall limit their testimony to 3 minutes. A timer will be used. Please state your name, address, affiliation, and whether you've taken the oath before testifying. Does council have any legal issues to discuss at this time?
No, I don't, Mr. Chair.
We'll now begin with a staff presentation. And Tim, I apologize for the formality, but it's the way we have to do business.
So Dr. Longley, members of the board, good morning. I'm Joe Karkoski. I'm heading up the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program. And since you asked to make it brief, I will make it really brief. I'll focus just on the late revisions that you have before you and just talk about those a little bit. So you should have had those handed out to you. I believe you have them. And basically these late revisions are a reflection of the drought conditions we're currently in. And so it allows the executive officer discretion to delay some of the deadlines by 1 year if there is decreased rice acreage. And so we've had conversations with the Rice Commission about these provisions and setting up this structure. And Tim will speak for himself, of course, but my understanding is they're comfortable with how these late revisions have been framed. So there are a couple things. One is with the grower requirements to produce the farm evaluation and nitrogen management plan. Those may be delayed by a year. Also associated with that, the California Rice Commission, there may be a delay of the requirements to prepare those templates. As staff, we're not concerned about these potential delays because there really aren't identified high vulnerabilities associated with rice, so we're not expecting any potential water quality impact. And again, the dates that we had in the tentative are still there. It's just if, as we go along, it seems like there's a significant drought impact on rice acreage, the executive officer has this discretion. Now, what that meant was we had originally envisioned that the farm evaluation would be used as the method for a rice grower to notify a landowner, a non-grower landowner. So if the farm evaluation were delayed, we still want to make sure the landowner has timely notification of the new order, so there's an additional provision associated with that. The other thing that we had was and this is just a straight 1 year delay for the submission of the groundwater trend monitoring work plan. If we would have kept it in October 2014, they would need to start working on it pretty darn soon, and that would be before they know how much rice acreage has been planted. And as you may recall from the previous workshop, we're not really seeing groundwater quality issues associated with rice, so delaying the submission of that work plan again should not have any water quality impact. And there's some associated delays in evaluating trends because we won't have enough data since the groundwater quality monitoring is delayed by a year. And we also eliminated, we noticed we had some duplicative provisions that we deleted. So with that, in summary, the order would regulate about 525,000 acres of rice in the Sacramento Valley. These requirements are specific to rice operations in the Sacramento Valley. The order, as the other irrigated lands orders, is adaptable to changing water quality conditions, and we believe it meets all of the applicable legal requirements. So therefore, staff recommends adoption of the order with late revisions. At this time, I would like to submit this abbreviated presentation, the agenda package, and the associated board files into the record. This concludes the presentation, and we're certainly available to answer any questions you may have.
Any questions, board members? Thank you, Joe.
Yep, you're welcome.
Tim, are you or Roberta going to present, or both of you?
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, Tim Johnson, President and CEO of the California Rice Commission. I'll just move our way down to the key items relative to the late revisions and just hit these quickly. Our crop in the Sacramento Valley will be one of the most profoundly affected by this drought, and that'll become apparent in a minute. We not only expect significant reductions in acreage, but also the potential for structural changes in our industry. That would mean rice dryers and potentially even rice mills going out of business. And we approached your staff understanding that where we are today, we may be in a very different place when planting is concluded. Just to give you an idea of the basis of that, Joe said about 550,000 acres is what our average is. That'll be important for you to remember as I move through the rest of these slides. We really have two driving factors that are going to impact our ability to plant this year. State Water Board actions, and probably glad these last weeks you've not been on the State Water Board. But right now it looks like our best estimate is that we will only receive 40% of the deliveries that we historically get out of the Sacramento River. For the Feather River, which is our other major drainage, it would be 50%. Again, that's our best case today as we stand here. Our growers, unlike growers in the San Joaquin Valley, have very limited ability to pump groundwater. Only about 30 to 50,000 acres, we think. Many of the wells have not been used since the early 90s. And the reason for that is, of course, because we've had reliance on secure surface water. No reason to drill a well. I expect that may be different in a few years. What are the impacts? Right now, and I talked with Don Bransford, who's chair of the Glen Close Irrigation District, as well as other irrigation district managers Friday. Best estimates is that we're going to have a 50 to 60% reduction in the acres of rice. Again, as we stand here today, we certainly all hope and pray for a lot of rain. Some growers will be at zero, or some portions of their operation will be at zero, and others may be up to 75%, so we'll see some variation. Our revenue, which is tied to crop production, will be reduced by $2.6 million. And just a caveat there that 25% of that budget, regardless of what the size of our income is water quality. We'll be utilizing this year $2 million of reserves. And over the next 18 months, as I'd noted before, we expect the impacts of the drought to really occupy all the space that we have in the office. Membership issues, communications, our local communities, habitat will be significantly impacted, as well our operations. So our understanding, as Joe had noted, is that from the groundwater assessment report is that rice has limited or no negative impact on groundwater. Our commitment, however, was that we wanted to make sure that we implemented all elements of the enhanced surface water portions of the WDR. We believe that is where rice has the potential for the greatest impact, and we wanted to make sure that we continued with that. We also wanted to make sure that we didn't stand before you in a month happy and embarrassed, or 2 months happy and embarrassed. Happy that it rained, we got higher allocations, and embarrassed that we did not meet our obligations as originally lined out in the timelines in the original order. We wanted to make sure that we provided a trigger, an assessment for the executive officer. So our request was a delay in implementing the groundwater monitoring and reporting portions by 1 year from previous deadlines, and also the ability to delay the farm evaluation and related reports by 1 year. We just wanted to note, and I know I'm over my time, but I think this is probably the most important slide. We do support the WDRs presented by your staff, also the late revisions. Great appreciation for working with your staff over these last 6 years. I want to especially note my appreciation for the executive officer and staff and this board for considering the late revisions given the severity of the drought in the Sacramento Valley. Huge, means an awful lot to my growers, and we were able to report out that you were at least willing to entertain this discussion in our last board meeting, and the response was very, very positive. So thank you on behalf of our growers.
And I, as one board member, Tim, want to reciprocate by thanking you for your leadership. Any questions by members?
Tim, living in Yolo County, I'm somewhat familiar with what's happening there. I'm interested in what information might be available, what you're looking at with respect to the impact of this reduction on local economies, particularly like in Colusa-Clinton counties, where this is a huge part of their economy.
I think it's going to be variable. I think Yolo County in particular is going to be specifically impacted. We know our industry is about a $5 billion industry, about 25,000 jobs. Talking with some farmers last Friday, I think they'll be able to maintain their permanent employees. Seasonal employees just not going to have as much work, not going to be as many of them. I think that in areas in Butte County, you probably perhaps see that the impact will be less. And so I think by about June or July, we'll be able to assess those communities that will be most impacted by this drought in the Sacramento Valley. And for this board, just beyond rice, surface water cuts hurt most in the Sacramento Valley, not because farmers in other areas are not important, but because, again, we really have not drilled an awful lot of wells historically. And so your ability to go over and take the pump off and go put it on the wellhead and pump and still be able to make a crop for rice, for tomatoes, for the other annual crops in particular, really you'll see a broader impact. I don't want to diminish at all the zero allocations for the San Joaquin Valley folks. We just find ourselves in an unfortunate position in Sacramento Valley that may be a bit different.
Thank you. Jenny?
Tim, I just wanted to thank you for all the work that you have been doing with the board. Certainly the GAR is quite a masterpiece, to say the least, and very interesting, and the leadership role that you guys have taken to be proactive and put your foot first and look at this as we have been moving down the WDR process and adding groundwater in. Has been great. So I just wanted to thank you for that, and I look forward to voting on this order.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If I just make one concluding comment, I again want to emphasize our commitment that if the water situation should happen to change, we fully intend to move forward with all of the timelines as originally outlined in this order. We appreciate your accommodation and will only use it if necessary. Thank you.
Unfortunately, it may be necessary. Very unfortunately. Roberta, do you want to add anything? Thank you. Tess? Thank you. John Dickey? Thank you. Alyssa is available for questions. Right. Carrie? No comments. Thank you. And the other cards I have are, if needed, Summer Bundy, Lisa Porta, and Bonnie Starr. If any of you wish to speak, please come forward. Okay, I want to thank you very much. I think at this point simply we will, is there any discussion among members of the board? Can I have a recommendation from the executive officer?
I will echo Joe's recommendation that the board adopt the order as proposed with late changes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To close the hearing, time for discussion, and if someone, and I'll entertain a motion with late revisions.
So I'll make the motion, and I want to say that along with making the motion with late revisions, I appreciate that staff is open to considering the special circumstances that occur from time to time, and We recognize that the people we're working with are good actors. So having said that, I am glad to make this motion with the late revisions.
I'll
Thank you.
second that.
It's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? If not, we'll go to voting. This is a voice vote. All in favor state so by saying aye. Opposed say no. Abstentions? Motion carries. Thank you very much. The board will be back in session here at 1 o'clock.
We have a closed session announcement to make.
Yes, go ahead and make the announcement.
Yeah, the board will be meeting in closed session to discuss the, it is located on closed session item litigation filed by the Central Valley Board against other parties